Okay, well, welcome to SRB19. I just want to quickly
bring up the agenda, Secretariat.
Yeah, are you going to bring it up? Okay.
Yeah, they'll bring it up for us. So just a reminder, if you do need to make anything larger, just use this button on the screen here. I think you can see the cursor. And I'm going to do it. We'll just go full screen momentarily, and then you can zoom in and out. And then you just press escape to get back to the main view. Okay, so I'll pass to you, Chair, to work us through how you'd like to proceed.
Are we actually connected to Olaf and Sven and them, or is just their video off?
Just avatars.
Okay. Okay. For some reason, I'm not getting your
Oh, I just had my video off.
video.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's get started.
Sean,
So I guess we
I'm
can
here
open
too.
and adopt the agenda. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to go over the agenda. It looks similar to most previous agendas. Is everybody good with that? Okay, so let's move into agenda item 3 then, which is IPHC process. I assume Dave will run us through this.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. This one's pretty
Take it away,
straightforward
Dave.
as always. Yeah, it's just a reminder what the of the rules of procedure were published again or revised again at the annual meeting this year, and so the terms of reference for the Scientific Review Board haven't changed. They're just their references changed to the 2021 version, which is available on the website. Noting that the agenda has been adopted, again, just a reminder in terms of the IPHC process that this is the second Scientific Review Board meeting in the calendar year. The first, as you recall, is meant to redirect the Secretariat to undertake additional work and gather additional information to present at this meeting for the SRB's consideration. So the primary purpose of this meeting is to review that material and then make clear recommendations to the Commission on how you would like the Commission to consider the work that has been undertaken throughout the course of the last year. In doing so, we prepared paper 03, which is the updates on the actions arising. So if the Secretary could just bring that up for us, please. So paper 03, as indicated, is just an update on all of the actions arising from the last SRB meeting. So this the 18th session held in June of this year. Now, Appendix A to that paper, and it's not scrolling for me for some reason. Try doing it this way. There we go. So Appendix A highlights all of the various actions, requests for action from the SRB to the Secretariat. All have either been completed or are ongoing and have a SRB meeting paper assigned to them. And so for all of it except the first two, and I'll cover those in just a moment, you will either see that it's been completed and reference the SRB019 paper. So I'm just having difficulties with the mouse. It won't let me scroll in full screen mode, so I have to jump back, which doesn't make it easy to read, unfortunately. Secretariat has any idea of why that's not allowing me to scroll? Support team, are you there? No. Yeah, it's just not allowing me to scroll in real time. That's okay. Look, this is one of those simple papers where the various requests, as I said, are completed or ongoing, and you're going to receive live updates today, tomorrow, and the next day for all of those that are signaled as either completed or ongoing. The exception to that is request number 1 and 2, which are pending, and both of those tasks were assigned for delivery at the 2022 SRB meeting, so SRB 20 in 2022, so for next June. So, Chair, noting that all of those have either been completed or are ongoing and you're going to receive updates, except for those first two, just to keep in mind throughout the course of the meeting how you would like to handle those first two requests. We could either just incorporate them into this section in the agenda, or we could also incorporate them into the relevant section throughout the report and update the request or make it a recommendation should you see fit. So I would just suggest you keep that in mind. And then we can just move through the rest of the agenda. So noting that is the end of agenda item 3.2. Unless there's any questions on those actions arising, we can jump to 3.3, which is, again, just a simple paper on the outcomes of the 97th session of the Commission. This is paper 04. It's just provided for reference. There is essentially no changes to the version that you saw at the June SRB meeting. So it's just there for reference, so that as you go through this meeting, if you do need to remind yourselves of what the Commission's direction has been, you can just refer to this particular paper. There was an additional meeting, a special session, which included some redirection on the MSE program of work at SS11, I believe. Memory, if I recall that correctly. Yep, getting nods. And so Alan's going to provide you an update on what the Commission added as additional recommendations at that point when he presents later, probably tomorrow. And so that wraps up agenda item 3.3, and then we can just jump, Chair, to agenda item 3.4, which is the updates from the two science advisors. Back to you, Chair.
And she sent me an email earlier with just one item she wanted to bring up, but maybe we'll start with Anne Marie if she wants to provide an update.
Hi. Let me. Here we go. Figure out my settings. Hi, everyone. Let's see. So going to the items that are on the agenda for FIS, I'd say that nothing really for the SRB. The concerns seem to mostly be around process. For the stock assessment, one question that came up was around the idea that next year is going to be a full stock assessment. And so a question that sort of popped up was whether that's like the 3-year rotational schedule of having a full assessment, whether that's still necessary, whether that's the best use of Ian's time, essentially. And then in terms of the MSE, I think there was a bit of a concern around finding balance between the technical work and the process, how to essentially not let either one of them get too far behind, particularly since the MSE group now is back down to Alan, which if we just had one, that's a good one to have, but still it's one person as opposed to 3. And I guess a general question around scoping, like what's realistically achievable between now and AM 2023, I think is when we've got some deliverables going on, given the list of priority items and the schedule of their meeting schedule. On the biological and ecosystem research, the current plan as well as the future 5-year plan, I think my broader read around some of the questions that the commissioners had last week was more about it. Like they had some specific questions, but I think my broad read of their questions would be that it would be helpful to be able to specifically describe how some things like either egg output work or the DMR work, how it directly translates into the work that they see and the decisions they have to make. So essentially how it transfers into the day-to-day stuff that comes across their desks. In terms of topics, I think I heard a few people mention like a lot of discussion around selective fishing methods, particularly to avoid or decrease whale depredation. There were a few questions from a few different commissioners about connectivity across the international borders. So with the Western Pacific on the Russian side, for example. And then also on climate change from a few commissioners, and for it to maybe play a bigger role in the next 5-year plan. Just a thought from my thought was that like we currently have like I think 5 main items that are reported out on, and so maybe would adding climate change to one of those things that we report out or staff report out on regularly to elevate it along the lines that reproduction or migration is, would that be helpful for the commissioners? And then lastly, the economic analysis. I don't really have a good sense of how it's being used, but which is neither here nor there. But I'm also not getting a good sense from the commissioners that they have a clear idea as to how the output is going to be used. So that's essentially where my feeling for where things are going with the economic analysis is, or some of the questions that are coming up. I think that's mostly it.
Mostly, it sounds like a good comprehensive list. Thank you.
I can add more. I can always
Yeah.
add more.
Sounds like you guys are busy. Just want to make sure I have some of this clear here. So I think it was your third bullet. You were asking about scoping the MSE given the schedule and expectations. Was that what it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, I think the delivery date is for the annual meeting in January, February 2023.
Yeah.
And usually the MSAB has 2 full meetings a year. And so like just in terms of what's actually realistically deliverable between now and then, both from the technical perspective as well as the process perspective.
The other clarification was on the first one about the stock assessment. So, and I don't have the image of the rotation, the schedule in my mind, but I assume you were looking at it. So there's a full stock assessment next year, but that's because I remember we talked about the schedule, the 3-year rotation kind of thing. So you're saying that there's a stock assessment scheduled outside that rotation?
No, I think it was based on Ian's report that he said that next year, so 2022, is a full assessment year, I think. And regardless of whether it is or isn't, the general question was whether the 3-year rotational schedule still makes sense.
I can speak to that a little bit
I mean,
more.
particularly since
Versus what?
we've had versus something else. I guess that is the question. And particularly since we've had the full assessment, it didn't seem to flag anything huge. And then we've had Olaf come on and we've had Sven come on. And so you almost get like a new review every time we get a new SRB member. So I guess that is a question in terms of whether a 3-year full review cycle is like what sort of balance, what's the trade-off between having a full review every 3 years and then having Ian work on something else during the 3rd year as opposed to a 4-year review cycle or a 5-year review cycle.
Ian, I think I heard you. Did you want to comment on that?
Well, I was just going to say, at the beginning of my presentation, I'd be happy to speak to this in a little more detail and maybe raise some of the pros and cons and
Okay.
topics that might be addressed next year. So I'm happy to get back to this topic, and thanks for
Great.
raising it, Anne-Marie.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry, Anne-Marie, can I just ask briefly
Right.
what you mean by you get a full review every
Yeah,
time?
sorry, it was probably a poor choice of words in terms of not a full review, but just a new set of eyes and a new perspective coming in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll defer that to when Ian can speak about it directly. That's great. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think we maybe maybe we can get some comments from Josep in the biological research program about the climate change issue, because I think that is an important one that maybe we can have a brief discussion about that. Is that okay with you, Josep?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it in every section. About if you know if anybody kind of has something come to mind in their section, yeah, feel free to add um, some ideas, and then maybe we can have a wrap up discussion towards the end. Thanks for bringing that up, Olaf. Okay, now for Carrie, she says she doesn't think there's anything major to report on the U.S. side that the SRB hasn't heard before. So, one decision point for the future concerns what the future of the MSAB looks like. Not the MSE, but the Stakeholder Advisory Board, the MSAB. It might be helpful for the commissioners to hear if the SRB has thoughts on what stakeholder advisory boards in MSE processes have or haven't been able to accomplish, or thoughts on the MSAB itself. So, yeah, that is more of a direct question to the SRB to consider. So, I have to think about that. Should I forward this text to the Secretariat, Dave, so we have a record of this?
When I provide you the draft framework this afternoon, Chair, you can just drop it straight in. Might be easiest.
Okay. Okay. And maybe we'll try to flag that topic, since it is somewhat MSE specific, and when we talk about the MSE when we get there. Okay. That wraps up our observer updates. So I think we're well ahead of schedule here. Does anybody have anything to raise at this point for this for process-wise? Any other open questions about process? I know one. Well, yeah, I won't bring it up now, but does anybody have any process questions or issues to raise?
I guess, yeah, I guess the only other thing I'll throw in there, Chair, is just the flagging of membership as well. Obviously, we have the 4 current SRB members, and I understand there might be some movement in the near future.
Right.
And I don't know if you wanted to flag that now or some other point.
Ian trying out different things in the assessment process, different settings and those kinds of things. And we as SRB members then comment on those things. But just coming on board and asking a few questions doesn't actually mean Ian gets to investigate all of those things. So I'm not sure the review as you see it is the
chair,
same
speaking
thing.
on behalf of, I was just going to say, just so we have it up front, we
Yeah,
certainly
I can
appreciate all your
just point
contributions
it
over the
out.
last
I
couple of
guess
years.
I was going to talk
And
to
it's
the
too bad it's
SRB
cut a bit
first,
short,
but I'm taking
I
a
wish you
new
luck on
job
your
with
next
the European
endeavor.
Commission, and so unfortunately they won't allow me to do other work outside. So I'm afraid this is likely to be my last
No,
meeting.
not unless I haven't heard about it yet.
And I'm particularly sad that it didn't work out to be a physical meeting. Whose fault is that?
You- you- I, I
Sorry,
hope so.
what?
It's unfortunate it won't be on the SRB. I'm really sorry to lose you, Sven.
Okay. Any other?
Yeah. On process, I had a... Well, I see you're doing some work for the European Commission somewhere, aren't you? Oh, okay. I saw your name on the sites with some EU project, but never mind.
No, you'd be correct. So the
I'm
commission
sure
is
we'll
simply
meet at
considering
some point.
updates at the recent
There are
work
enough
meeting.
conferences
And
around.
at the interim meeting, they'll consider more formal, structured advice and direction. So at the work meeting, it's really just a matter of bringing the commissioners up to speed on
Well,
a
thank you
full
very
range
much.
of issues.
As I say,
And in some
can't be
cases, they might
helped,
provide
but it's a
initial
fixed-term
clarification of the
contract,
sort
so
by the interim meeting.
maybe
but
they'll
they
have me
generally
back
don't provide
afterwards.
any other direction. The Commission is scheduling another informal meeting towards the end of late October.
Just quickly, Sean, on the
primarily that will
process
be
thing.
aimed at the management strategy evaluation.
I noticed that
program
the
of work,
Canadian
and one other task which currently eludes me, but not specifically the economic work.
Commissioner's representative asked about, Anne-Marie asked about the
Okay. Well, moving on. I think we are ready to get into the Fishery Independent Survey. Ray, take it away if you're ready.
Okay, just checking my microphone. You can let me know if you can hear me. Oh. Okay. Can anybody hear me? Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, as long as I can be heard, just give me a second. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or whatever, good evening, wherever you are.
Am I the only
This
one who
one's a
doesn't
little
hear
bit of
Ray?
a different. Okay. Sean can't hear me.
I don't know. Can somebody type in the chat or something whether they even hear me? Oh. Thank you. Yeah. I can hear you.
That's.
Oh, I hear Ray now.
You can hear me. Okay.
I can't hear you now, yeah.
All right. Okay, we've got the can you hear me ritual out of the way, hopefully. So this is a little bit of a different presentation than usual in that it has 4 different mini presentations within it, each with their own recommendations for you, the SRB. First one, hopefully, is the shortest. It is just a quick recap of the designs we proposed at the June meeting and that you endorsed at the June meeting for 2022 to 2024, just as a prelude to the upcoming interim meeting. And then I'll be reviewing some modeling of the IPHC length weight data that we've been collecting over the last few years, with the goal of revising our length weight relationship. You requested at SRB017, SRB17, information on you began a discussion on the IPHC hook competition standardization. And so I thought a good starting place would be to review that standardization, which we haven't done for a few years, so some members haven't seen it before. And that can be a jump off for further discussion. Idea of how to account for the effects of whale depredation on the fish within the space-time model. We'll review that as well for your input. Okay, so the first item, the design evaluation, which we undertook at the beginning of the year and presented to you at SRB019. And based on that evaluation, it was expected that proposed designs would lead to estimated indices of density that would meet bias and precision criteria. And in your report, you endorsed the final 2022 design and provisionally endorsed the 2023 to 24 designs that we proposed at that session and in the accompanying documents. And those figure references, I believe, are to your report. And this is the design that you endorsed for 2022, 1,005 stations to be fished, indicated in orange. A mix of randomization, random sampling within the core areas, and then sub-area sampling to ensure we meet the bias and precision requirements in the other areas. And the 2023 design and 24 design. I'm not going to dwell on these because you've seen them and already endorsed them. This is simply kind of underlining your endorsement for the purpose of the commissioner's information. So we're recommending that you recommend that the commission note your endorsement of the proposed 2022 design and the provisional endorsement of the proposed 2023 to 24 designs. So we're not reviewing these again here, we're just asking that you recommend the commission note your endorsement. So there's really not much to say to that, unless, well, if there are any interjections, otherwise I'll keep moving on to the other parts of this presentation. Oh, sorry, I actually at this point, I have some extra slides, I just remembered. If Ed or whoever is controlling those could bring those up now, switch the presentations. Because as well as those proposed designs based on the scientific objectives, we have been working, well, particularly Ian Stewart has been working through some modifications of those designs in order to meet the secondary objective, in particular of long-term revenue neutrality. So we're presenting those for your information as well. So again, this is for 2022 only we're talking about here. So this was the design we proposed that met the scientific criteria with bias and precision criteria being met in the core areas and in the outlying areas through different types of sampling. Now, this is a very expensive design and it would be expected, and Ian can jump in and correct me if I'm getting this off a bit, but I believe it'd be expected to lose in the order of $1.5 million on this particular design. So we've looked at, or Ian has looked at, ways we can modify this design in order to reduce those losses while still meeting our scientific objectives. And so one possibility is optimizing for cost, and that is to put back to fish additional stations in the core areas in particular, and with particular focus on those areas that have the highest catch rates. So if I flip back between those and you look at the core areas, you see that The only thing that's changing between these designs is addition of stations to the core areas. And that is expected to add additional revenue in those areas and thereby bring down the net cost of implementing this survey. Yes. I'm sorry. Maybe I flicked on a slide too far. 4CDE shouldn't be changing. Do you still see that happening? Okay. My apologies. I probably advanced to the next slide in my flicking back and forth. So, which brings me to the next option that's being considered. One of our most expensive regions is 4CD, and we did fish. Let me get the pointer here. We did attempt to, our goal was to fish all of our 4CD stations in 2021. We weren't able to do that, but we did fish the northern section of 4CDE, which is the first time most of those stations have been fished since 2016. And our interest in 4CD is that it's a dynamic area that's most likely to be affected by changing climate. And our evidence has been that there's been a northward shift in population over the last few years.
When I put it on a full screen, you can't unmute.
Border, and so we have an interest in the movement or the.
I can hear you, Sean, but I don't, and I can hear Ray, but I don't know why you can't hear Ray.
That most northern part was probably the area we were most interested in. So one possibility, without compromising our science, is that we can omit that in 2022.
There seems to be something changing in 4D CDE as well. That's not part of the core area, is it?
And you can be more specific on what a chunk means if necessary, but this preserves the remainder of the design that you saw in the June.
No, it isn't now, but it was.
And then we have
but it was a second ago.
A big money loser in terms of net revenue. So we can also alternatively look at optimizing this design, which requires addition of fewer stations than the previous optimized design to the core areas. And again, this time I'll try and flick back and forth between those two. And you can see that we are adding stations. Sorry, went too far. We are adding stations, particularly 2C is pretty much 100% sampling, but we are adding stations to 3B, 3A, and 2B as well, in order to increase the revenue and offset the cost of the more expensive components. So I will finish with this recommendation for you that you note these alternative design options that optimize the design that you endorsed in the June meeting for cost, and thereby meet the goals of long-term revenue neutrality, the secondary objective, without compromising the scientific goals of the FIS. And before I open it for any discussion, I wonder if Ian has any additional comments, because he's the one who's been doing most of the work on costing out these designs. Ian,
sorry, I forgot to unmute. My bad.
And you're a frozen head, so I can't tell if you're trying to speak either. So
yeah, I'm here in the boardroom too, but we seem to be frozen there. Anyhow, I'll just add a couple things. One is that this is a somewhat more optimistic picture than we had going into the 2021 season. Based on much better prices for halibut, the base science design is closer to revenue neutral than we were in the previous planning cycle. As we have had to do in the past, it does appear that we need to add some additional stations to make the survey near net revenue neutral. However, I'll note that when we add these stations, because we're using a model-based estimator for these data, we of course benefit from all of the additional information. We're not changing the base science design, so we're not biasing the design, but in fact we end up with decreased uncertainty in the final estimate as a function of these stations that have been added, which potentially, depending on future catch rates and prices, could allow us an even smaller design at some point in the future. benefiting from the tighter confidence intervals that we might generate in 2022. As Ray has noted, the decision that's still left to be made is mostly a feasibility decision. So from here, with two options that meet revenue neutrality, we have one where we add roughly 100 stations and sacrifice a little bit of sampling in the Bering Sea, noting that we would still meet our bias and variance targets in the Bering Sea. We just wouldn't be quite as proactive on the issue of potential ecosystem shift in the Bering Sea. And then the second option is to sample all the Bering Sea, but to do that we would have to add approximately 250 stations to the design in order to pay for that. Now, the reason that we've left this available, essentially open as discussion for feasibility, is because, as Ray noted, we in fact didn't receive enough bids on 4CD&E to complete the whole area, and actually had to work iteratively with some vessels to get them to do as much as we got done in 4CD&E. It's very expensive, it's very distant, and the one processing plant that's generally open in the Pribilof Islands, which is in that little square box in the middle of the Bering Sea, was actually closed due to COVID in both 2020 and 2021. So they were running all the way back to the Aleutian Islands to deliver fish. So we had some real challenges in getting a vessel up there, and as Ray noted, they didn't even complete the stations that we had hoped they were going to complete, but they did succeed in doing the very northern edge along the Russian EEZ, which Ray and I felt was the most critical section, as that's where we would expect the most dramatic distributional shifts if those were going to occur. So to recap, we've got two designs that exceed our minimum science targets, that will meet our bias and variance targets everywhere. And we're essentially leaving that up now to the FIS team to decide whether they think they can or can't field the additional stations and or get enough bids to complete the Bering Sea. So this is a little bit impromptu because we've just been finalizing this as the information is coming in, but we thought you would appreciate having a rundown on how the the secondary objectives of the survey affected the base science design this year. Sure. That's correct. Yes, so the process we go through is we add stations to the areas that are revenue positive, and we do that until the entire design becomes balanced. So we end up adding more stations in areas that are higher, that have a higher revenue to cost ratio. But they are supplementing the base design. So the original proposed stations don't change. Those are still going to get fished. Exactly, and that's why we have that tertiary objective in our survey. So our first objective is scientific criteria. The second one is revenue neutrality. And the third one is a combination of minimizing our footprint on the stock and also providing a platform for other research opportunities. And so we do, that's why we don't just add stations everywhere and run, for example, run a surplus to pay for other things. I can give you, I think, the percentage. Well, I can't give you the percentage, but I can give you an estimate. We would project that under this design that you're seeing on the screen here, just make sure I'm on the right design, the total landings from the survey would be just over 600,000 pounds. recalling that the total mortality was 39 million pounds this year, and of that, I believe 60-some% was the commercial fishing. Yes, and so Sven, you raise an important point, which is that the fleet is very sensitive to removals from the stock by the survey, and so that's why we do have that explicit objective to minimize where we can, and only increase the survey to
Ian,
generate revenue.
before we move on, can I just ask a couple of questions? In one of the pictures, and I can't remember which one, it seemed like the alternative design dropped stations in a somewhat clustered, but that's just perception, right? They are still randomly added or not.
Sure. That's correct. It's the upper portion and it's the islands as well. So those three little clusters, two in the box and one up
Okay.
north. We benefit in 4CD&E from the extensive trawl survey that's conducted by NIMS, and that it's not shown on this map, but it covers with a relatively high density the entire shelf area of the eastern and northern Bering Sea shelf. And so Ray can add to this, but that alone provides us with a substantial amount of information, even without our own survey. So we'll have pretty good sampling in the Bering Sea in 2022, even if we conducted nothing up there. The reason we've prioritized the Bering Sea for CD&E for additional sampling, even above and beyond our minimum variance, our minimum bias, maximum bias, and minimum variance targets, is that we recognize that species distributions are changing very rapidly in the Bering Sea. We've seen shifts in cod and pollock and several crab species, and changes in sea ice cover and cold pool extent. And so we're trying to be getting back to this idea of being proactive about climate change.
Yeah.
We are trying to maintain as high a level of sampling in 4CD&E as we can support, given the technical and feasibility constraints of our survey, so that we can attempt to see if distributions or biology or other things are changing in the Bering Sea. And it's not without some trepidation that we even provide an option that has reduced sampling. We've argued pretty heavily for the last couple of years that we really need some additional sampling.
And the other thing is that you could quite quickly enlighten us to what is the percentage of the total
other areas
quota
where we'll actually then compromise the variance of the index
FIS
itself.
takes.
So we're sort of
Because
trying
you
to
can make
balance
the
those as we
argument,
go.
well,
But some
we'll
support
just
from the SRB
use the
for
FIS,
the
make
need to
it
be
cost
proactive in the
neutral
Bering Sea, I
by,
think could be helpful.
and
So
then there's
that makes a
less
lot
for
of
the
sense, Ian,
fishery,
and I
isn't
was wondering
really
about that because it
useful
doesn't
either for
seem
them.
justified just on the basis of, providing a better index for the stock assessment. But it seems like there is quite a bit of justification from more of a research perspective for understanding the range shift. And I guess I would just follow up then and ask whether there is any sort of research plan, even informal at this point, to study that range shift there, and whether this design really meets the goals of that research plan. It seems like it sort of started out as just trying to make sure that you're not getting biased in that area because of the limited sampling. But now it's kind of pushing beyond that, since it was already sampled last year, and moving into more of a research framework. And so I just wanted to make sure that there's also an analysis plan for that data, and that they're collected in a way that's optimized for that research objective, not just for the index.
Thanks for that question. And Ray may want to add to this as well, but Ray's recent paper on the space-time model did highlight the observed shift
You
to
can
the
say a
north
tiny
of the centroid
percentage.
distribution in the Bering Sea. I will note that halibut has not seemingly has not responded to the same degree as some other species. And so we're in a challenging spot now where we don't really have strong evidence that change is occurring for halibut yet. but yet we recognize that several competitors and prey species are changing rapidly, and so we, in some ways, we anticipate halibut
And
will
that
change.
seems sensible.
Again,
I
we're
just
trying to be
didn't
proactive
know
in
what
suggesting
percentage
additional
it
samples so
was,
that we
and
can
I was
detect
just
it if
trying
it
to
happens.
convince myself
But
that, or
somewhat more
trying to
challenging
reassure
when we don't
myself
have
that that
evidence that it is
third
so strongly
objective
occurring
is
yet.
still bearing enough weight. So that's fine. Thank you.
Sorry, it's slightly different, and I apologize if I said slope survey. It's the NOAA Shelf Survey, the Eastern Bering Sea and Northern Bering Sea Shelf, those data we use in the space-time model. Our stations are generally along the deeper edge, and this is where the larger adult biomass of halibut occurs in the Bering Sea. So we get a lot of information about fish that are available to the directed Pacific halibut fishery from our survey that we might not get from the trawl survey. Unfortunately, the Bering Sea slope trawl survey has not occurred, I believe, since 2012. So they've That's right. And so we need to be prepared to cover those. We need to be prepared to cover those depths with our survey, because I don't think there's much chance of that starting up right away.
Use of those data wasn't going to add anything to our index. So, but again, you're right. Between the two surveys. So there are some NIMS survey stations that are around the eastern edge of our stations there. And we do have one third data source. And we have a third data source in Norton Sound, and that's an annual troll survey. Norton Sound is just off the map here. And annual troll survey from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and that's been fished annually for the last few years. And in fact, it goes back into the 70s, I believe, when it was done by NIMS. But it's another source which provides information on the extreme north of the halibut range.
This is Joseph. If I may, I'll follow up on Olaf's comment on the type of research that we're intending to do to look at northern distribution of Pacific halibut in the Bering Sea, and that was precisely one of the objectives of the
Ian,
research proposal that you evaluated
for
or at
for
least
clarification,
examined that was provided in the
you saying that
This was a proposal that was
the
submitted
NOAA survey
to
covers
NCRB,
the
and one of the
whole
objectives was really to look at the
of
genetic
the Bering Sea
characteristics of fish
slope,
that were caught in the
which is true, but I think
northern Bering
it's
Sea,
the shelf survey that
below and
would
above,
cover the areas that
decreasing
you're actually sampling,
and,
right? And the
this
slope
proposal has not
survey is
been,
predominantly
decided upon yet,
recruits.
so we do not know the results of this proposal yet. Thank you.
Yeah. Exactly, and it seems highly uncertain that they will be able to start it up again. I just know this from Stan Kotvicki, who runs
in a
part
clearer,
of
more
that survey.
rigorous, a more expansive way anyway.
They're
Just one final thing, you
continually
mentioned
struggling.
our paper from published last year, which tracked the change of the center of biomass of Pacific halibut. And I will note that there has been a northward drift in the center of Pacific halibut biomass in the Bering Sea.
No, which is
over the
why I
last,
think even the northern,
possibly up to 10 years now.
4 CDE in
And
general
so,
is more important
part of that
than one
initially was
might
maybe
think
a decrease in population in the
if
south.
you look at just where the
the recent
stations
surveys
are.
in the northern Bering Sea, particularly from the
It's
Patrol Survey and our own
the
2016
slope
survey,
survey only occurs every other year in the first place,
showed
and
when you plot
they've
those out,
missed quite
the
a few.
locations of halibut, that there does seem to be increasing densities in the north, even though they're still relatively low densities. So being able to track that throughout the range is as you indicate, an important research goal.
Well, it might if you stop sampling there. I mean, it doesn't add a lot because you've got better samples or more informative samples. But if you didn't, then that might become valuable. But
this is Ian.
so
I think we would appreciate that.
it's the slope survey that's used, just the shelf survey that's used,
noting that
which doesn't
we are
even overlap
logistically
with the
constrained with our
area
ability
that
to sample in the Bering Sea.
you are
And so,
sampling in 4
as much as we
CDE,
have
right?
prioritized this, we may or may not actually be able to sample it, just due to feasibility of generating vessels.
Sure.
And there is the trade-off of having to add additional stations in the core area to cover the additional expense potentially.
Yep. Okay, great.
If I may
That's a-
add, that also calls for continuation of our sampling efforts in collaboration with the NIMS straw survey in the northern Bering Sea. So those samples are actually critical, not just for our plant studies on population structure and distribution, but also with future work that could involve samples from early juvenile stages. We may get to that later in the meeting when we discuss our progress and contemplating future work on close-kin mark recapture studies. Thank you.
parts of the range or parts of individual regulatory areas in that way. No, it's better than that. They were sampled in 2010 by NIMS, and then the second time they went up there was 2017. But they've essentially, except for last year because of COVID, they've sampled it every year since. And in addition to that, we have the annual in the far north, and one of the parts where halibut are probably at their greatest in number. Um, 5 or 6 years. That's correct. All that would be doing is essentially select.
Right. So all the I don't mean to criticize it, but all the tool is doing is displaying output from the space-time model. It doesn't allow you to sort of rerun the space-time model, looking at the value of different samples to the overall variance. Yeah. Okay.
It isn't the only thing I do, believe it or not. That's because I didn't unmute.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Ed, could thank you. Okay, I'm going to move into the second part. Each of these things always, there's always interesting questions. Relationship to estimate Pacific halibut weight from length when direct weight measurements are not recorded. And this relationship has been around for 95 years, and it was estimated from 454 fish captured in IPHC regulatory area 2B, and in fact only a relatively small part of that regulatory area. Nevertheless, until relatively recently, the relationship seemed to hold up quite well. And a review by Bill Clark in 1991 showed no clear difference between a relationship measured from more recent data and from the historic relationship. But in recent years, there's been increasing evidence that this relationship is biased, with weight generally being overestimated on average. And Pacific halibut appear to have become thinner since the relationship was estimated, but in particular in the last 10, 20 years or so. So this has motivated us to collect our own weight data, and one of the goals has been to validate or otherwise the historic relationship. Since 2015, we've had our commercial sampling program was extended to add collection of dockside weight data on Pacific halibut. And since 2019, the FIS charter vessels have been equipped with motion compensated scales with the goal of also weighing all captured Pacific halibut. And so this has provided us with two very large data sources with thousands upon thousands of observations that allow us to obtain contemporary estimates of the length-weight relationship and also examine whether the relationship itself varies over time and space. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as estimating the relationship. We have to think about which version of the relationship we're working with, depending on the state of the fish when they were weighed. And so not only do we have to deal with the relationship estimation and the relationship itself, but we also have to examine the way we convert from one type of weight to another. So I won't go into this in detail. It is in the accompanying report, but there are different stages of capture, after capture, that a halibut can be weighed. So we have round weight, head on, not gutted, no ice and slime; gross, the vessel weight, head on, gutted, ice and slime; dressed weight, gross dock weight, and dressed weight, and then net weight. And net weight's kind of the currency of exchange, I guess, for most our uses anyway. Other industry and agencies make use of different weights, but we report in net weight. And so if we're getting weight in any of these other terms, then we have to apply some kind of conversion to that. And so estimating these conversions as well, having the data in order to validate these assumed conversion factors, is also part of this project. So we'll touch on that in this presentation, but if there are parts of this I don't get to, it's discussed in more detail in the accompanying document. Oh yeah, okay, so I do have some notes here that gross dock weight, commercial 032, commercial 032, dress dock weight are used for that. The FIS weights, we've been getting U32 round weight, 032 dressed vessel weight, and we've had some weight at the dock as well for the FIS, on the FIS. So we do need some conversions from our own data sources in order to get to net weight. So with the commercial data and the FIS data, but starting with the commercial data, what we did was we fitted just standard linear models on the log scale, which is the standard way of estimating these relationships, to estimate the parameters of the length to net weight relationship from the commercial sampling data, after applying whatever necessary conversion factors to get them in terms of net weight. So we're trying to estimate the parameters A and beta here, the intercept on the log scale and the slope. And so when we fit those models, these are some examples. There are a large number of plots in the accompanying document, but I picked out a few just to illustrate what's going on with these relationships in general. So this is these are estimated length-weight relationships from the 2020 data, commercial sampling data. And the blue line, which is a little hard to see, but I've tried to make it thicker. Let me get my pointer here. The blue line is the historic length-weight relationship. This is on the measured scale, and this is on the log scale over here. And you can see that in general, for most regulatory areas, and we've got each curve represents the curve estimated for a particular regulatory area from the 2020 data. The relationship estimated from our data is below the relationship that's been assumed for 95 years. And so this demonstrates that what we're saying before, that the fish are generally thinner than they are predicted to be under the old relationship. There's one exception, and that's regulatory area 3B, which matches the relationship fairly well, and we found that to be quite consistent over years. And on that subject, this is one regulatory area, but over the last 5 years of sampling. And this is 2C, but most regulatory areas show a similar pattern. In this case, regulatory area 2C's length-weight relationship, estimated separately for each year, is consistently lower than the historic relationship, particularly for larger fish, even in a relative sense on the log scale. And there's relatively little variability among years compared to what we saw in terms of the variability among areas across space. And that's a generally true statement for most regulatory areas. And you can see the caveats to that in the report, but I'll mention it a little bit going forward. So with the FIS length weight data, as with the commercial data, we fitted the same kind of models to estimate the parameters. We only have 2 years data available, third year being collected being this year. So we have little information on year-to-year variation, so I haven't looked at that so closely. The U32 fish, we also, as well as the O32 fish, getting net weight on those. And this was all based on, this is commercial data, so it's all based on O32, which means fish greater than or equal to 32 inches in length, which is the commercial size limit, even though the curves go below that length, which is 81.3 centimeters. On the FIS, we actually collect some U32 samples, and so we did record for a selection of those, both round and dressed weight, in 2019, which allows us to estimate a round to dressed weight relationship for use in subsequent years. Getting a dressed weight involves killing the fish, and we do this routinely for those fish that are randomly selected for an otolith collection, but otherwise we're releasing the small fish back into the ocean. And so if we only need to collect round weight because we have this relationship, then in the future we don't need to process those U32 fish in that way. So these are relationships for, again, by regulatory area. This is for 2019. Again, showing quite a lot of, this time the historic relationship is the blue, and there's 2 or 3 areas that are above the blue line, or on or above the blue line for the FIS data. But it again shows that there's a lot of spatial variation in these relationships consistent with the commercial data. If we pick a particular area, the same one we picked last time, this compares the, because we don't have enough years to really look at temporal variation. But this is the 2019 comparison of the FIS and commercial relationships. And you can see for at least 2C, we've got good agreement between the relationship estimated from the commercial data and the FIS data, and both provide smaller weights than the historic relationship. And this is 2020 as well. And this is to show that there is some variation in the relation, in how those, so this isn't always, we don't always get the same thing. So here they're consistent. In 2020, they were a little bit different. So there is some variation. Yes.
Are the curves here on the left plot corrected for bias there, or is that just using the MLEs of those coefficients from the?
It's using the MLEs. So we're correct. This is not a mean or anything. This is sorry. I think we can discuss that later. I don't believe a bias correction is necessary in this case. We are estimating a curve, the parameters of the curve, and the predicted value will be the points on the curve that you're estimating.
I mean, if you want the expected value of net weight, which would be the mean weight for a given length, then you do need a bias correction for that, if that's what the blue is.
That's an estimate of a sample mean in that case, right? It's not an estimate of a point on the line. It's a little bit different, and I know this is something that's come up before.
Yeah,
it's the MLE of a.
I think you do.
If you're transforming something that I don't think you do.
So you basically you have 2 parameters. The parameters like your 2 coefficients of the model both have uncertainty associated with them.
That's correct.
So you have to integrate that uncertainty into the function, into the back transformation.
You're thinking of a delta method type approach to estimating the value of a transformed variable, and this isn't the same thing as that. So if you're estimating a sample,
Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I'll let you continue.
Well, I was just going to say, like, you can compare them kind of line for line on this log scale, but on the back transform scale. I'm suggesting it can't without that correction.
I don't think that's correct, but we have these.
We don't have to resolve this minute.
Yeah, this is something.
I guess
I think. Sorry. Someone else.
No, go ahead. Finish, Ray.
No,
this is Kim. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, Kim. I think this is something we can set aside for another discussion, because I think I get why you're asking this, because it would change those curves and the comparison with the historical relationship, which was estimated in exactly the same way, too. And
it may be affected by the local variances too. If the variances differ among regulatory areas, it certainly looked like the variances differ between the commercial and the FIS, at least in the data, which I assume translates into uncertainty in the parameters.
I guess one point or question that I have is the scatter plots that you have, like you're showing right now, Ray, for 2019. It's pretty clear that the deviance that you're highlighting from historical values is primarily evident in the larger fish, and you really have a few large fish, which means the points that are going there, either transformed or not, really you have less confidence in, and maybe the deviation that you're seeing in a historical time sense is the fact that you just have increasingly fewer fish of larger size.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's clear, but the curves with the bulk of the fish being, I may be missing your point, but the bulk of the fish being sampled here, it's these fish. These fish are driving the relationship. There are many fish up here. They're not very influential in determining the relationship relative to the bulk of the fish here. So that the deviation from the historic is, I guess it begins here, but it's not just up here. You're absolutely correct, Sven. It does, and we've looked at those. Looked at that. It's not a strong effect in all areas, but there are some, like particularly 2B. I think you get lighter fish in the early part of the season, then they put on weight as you get towards the summer. Our goal is with looking at revising this relationship is providing a tool for, and I'll come to this, and my intention is to come to this in later slides.
How many times have those
approved
stations
tool for
actually
the
been
estimation of weight
sampled, though?
for use outside
I
of the
mean,
IPHC.
I know you're
So
showing
we
it
are
from the
collecting our own weights now.
predictions, but
So we're
in
measuring
those
the
10
weights directly.
years that you're
The
talking
few
about,
fish
they've
that
only
we
been sampled
measure directly, we estimate,
2
take their weights
times?
from a length, these
Is
related
that right?
relationships, for the starter anyway. But we have other users of our relationship, either agencies or guided anglers and so on, who need to estimate weight from length. And at the moment, they're using
Okay.
a 95-year-old relationship. And those data were also collected in summer, I should note, as our FIS survey is. So our goal is not to with this is not necessarily to, I mean, we can do this, but understand the variation in weight across the year and tailor a particular curve to a particular need. We're looking for a general tool that can be used outside of the
Yeah, I'll have a
IPHC
look
in an
at
easy fashion
the
without being too
tool when I
confusing
get a chance.
or
Thanks.
require too much manipulation by the user or input by the user. So it's basically a single curve, or a single curve by a regulatory area, and possibly updating that over time if we continue to see this change. But it sounds like your concerns might be a little deeper than that. But anyway, from my perspective, if this aggregates data over various parts of the year and produces a general average curve, then it's doing what we want it to do for that purpose.
Ray, this is Kim again. I know you don't have any historical data on sex, but how much of the temporal trend could be due potentially to changes in sex ratios?
I can't answer that. I don't know if Ian or Josep want to contribute. Okay, not hear anything. I guess we can okay. So summarizing this comparison, season March to November, but is limited to just the fishing grounds. The fish data is limited just to the summer survey period, but it's more. We fit a single relationship to all the data combined, ignoring source, and model 2 allowed the parameters to differ between the two data sources. And we did this for each regulatory area and each year, I think. For 2019 and 2020, which were the only years of overlap of the FIS and the commercial sample. And so it's one thing saying that there are differences between these curves. There's another saying that it matters in terms of the estimates for the weights that you actually get out of there, or the aggregated quantities that we're ultimately using. You know, like any individual fish, and its weight its observed weight is not going to match the predicted weight from the length relationship. But we hope that in aggregate, that the quantities we're estimating over many fish are accurate. So one quantity we use at the IPHC is we look at mean weights, and so we compare the observed mean weights to with the predicted mean weights under these two models to help understand the potential for bias in the model estimates, and compare that also with the historic curve. So model 2, which allows the parameters to differ between the two data sources, it predicted mean net weights within 1% of observed means of both commercial and FIS data for each year. And related to this delta transformation and so on, where I've used that before for transforming a mean. If you have a mean on the log scale and you want to transform that mean to the original scale, you need to make a bias adjustment and also correct the standard deviation of that estimate. That doesn't apply for an individual estimate, an individual value. So you can take the individual value and transform that to the original scale and then get a mean. And if you compare that with the bias corrected mean from the transformed bias value, you should find that they agree very well. That is how I've used the delta method before for correcting for bias. But anyway, that's a side note. But Model 2 is producing mean net weights on the original scale. I'm estimating the weight from the length-weight relationship on the original scale within 1% of the observed means on both commercial and FIS data each year, and by IPHC regulatory area. So the model with separate parameters for commercial and FIS data for the regulatory, each by regulatory area by year for 2019 and 2020 is producing accurate mean net weight. So in aggregate, it's doing well. As you might expect, Model 1, which did not have separate parameters for commercial and FIS data, given there are some differences between those estimated relationships as we saw in some of those examples, it didn't do quite as well, but it still produced mean net weights within 2% of the observed means in almost all cases. And the two cases that were the exceptions are noted in the report, and they were cases with less extensive data sampling at the fringes of the stock, and where it may have been that one data source was much larger than the other data source and so had a greater influence on the relationship. By contrast, the historical relationship had differences between predicted and observed means ranging from 1.1% to 10.7% for commercial data and minus 1.7% to plus 5.5% for the FIS data. So much larger differences in predicted mean weights by area and year from the historical relationship, and generally in a positive direction. Generally, it was overestimating mean weight, and sometimes by quite a substantial amount, up to 11%. So, and I know there'll be other elements to the discussion, but using the linear models to fit to contemporary data is likely to reduce bias in weight estimates relative to estimates from the historical relationship. Model 1, while less accurate in terms of estimating mean weight from our own data sources, it is simpler. It was still fairly accurate, and it's simpler and does not require users, example the other agency staff, to make a choice of which data source, commercial or FIS, most closely resembles their own. So not having to think, well, at this time of the year I should be using this data source because it's we want this to be simple. We want to improve on what we're doing now, but we want to keep it simple. And so estimating a relationship from combined sources, which represents a blend of the spatially extensive FIS and temporally extensive commercial samples, by temporally extensive I mean throughout the year, well, it's going to lead to a more generally applicable curve, while still likely to produce accurate estimates in the aggregate. A couple of notes: when we fitted these models, all the data from both sources had equal weight. So a source with larger sample size had more influence on the model results, and that might not be desirable. If we want a equal blend of the commercial and the FIS, of spatially extensive and temporally extensive, then one option would be to equally weight the two data sources. So apply lower relative weights to observations from the source with greater sample size when fitting the models. So you get the case where some areas where we might have extensive FIS sampling, like 4B when we do the survey out there, but there's not much in the way of commercial samples coming from 4B, and we often sometimes don't meet our sampling targets in that area. For example, 2A is another area like that. And given the apparent temporal stability from 2016 to 2020 and spatial variability, we recommend that we provide curves to non-IPHC users estimating from at least 3 years worth of combined data from commercial and FIS sources for each regulatory area. So we move to a regulatory area specific length weight curve that's estimated from a combination of both data sources. That this is a curve. This is something, because we're continuing to collect these data at the commercial sampling and the FIS sampling, that we can reevaluate going forward an additional year's data collected, so we can see if the weight at length or the condition factor of the fish continues to change in whatever direction, and whether that happens in different ways for different areas. We do have some outstanding data needs. I talked about all those correction factors. We lack data at the moment to validate the assumed round to net weight conversion for O32 fish, recognizing that some agencies are measuring their fish as round weight, so that conversion is being used outside the IPHC. But this is something we can address by obtaining two measurements on fish, round and dressed, on the FIS. We also have no data to validate adjustment factors for ice and slime, which is at the moment assumed to be a 2% deduction to go from dressed weight to net weight, despite collecting commercial weight samples since 2015. For that, we need fish that are weighed before they're washed and after they're washed, and we have not been able to obtain those within the plants that we're sampling. So our recommendations are that you note this paper, and that you recommend that we provide a revised length to net weight relationship for each IPHC regulatory area based on the modeling of the combined FIS and commercial data to be used for calculation for all non-PHC mortality estimates where individual weights cannot be collected for 2021 and until further notice. And noting that, it's clear you have some reservations or some further points of discussion. So I'm interested in getting further feedback on this, which is why we're presenting it to you today.
Put Ray out of a job as well.
Known in the data, and that
No.
performs relatively well if you have sparse sex data for some category. I don't know how well whether it would matter much if you just had no sex data at all for the historical period. And then the second thought is that it would be interesting to see whether the deviations could be partly explained by annual area-specific temperature. So developing a covariate there to try to explain why different areas seem to be responding differently through time in terms of their trends relative to that long-term historic curve. Are the areas that are really trending away more places that have experienced more rapid warming? Yeah, just a few thoughts there. Yeah.
I think what Kim means is that those large fish that you see are
Yeah, I'm going
actually
to.
driving
Thank you. That's a good question. I'm going to turn that over to Ian.
the bias
and
even
he's
in
more
the
familiar with
center of that curve.
those other data sources like recreation
And I guess you'd have to have a
on.
plot of what the weights are in the relative weights in the analysis are, how much they pull it out. But one question was, I think Giuseppe
So are
showed
all
it
estimated based
last
on the
year.
length of the fish to convert to an
The
estimate?
condition factor
So
changed dramatically
in a
throughout
particular
the
year,
year,
those would range from perhaps
and not
30 to
accounting for the
35% of the total
differences
mortality on the halibut
in
stock. So enough that it is
the
actually
condition
will
or the
matter.
timing of the sample seems to me to be problematic. I mean, after all, really, all it may be is that the timing of the catches is shifting. Therefore, the commercial data is showing a different condition factor, but actually the
Right, this
live
is Joseph.
weight that you're interested in is
fact,
at the
the
time
only
of
data that we
spawning,
have for
because
condition
that's the
factor that you alluded to
spawning
before
biomass
when you
index
mentioned
that you are
we
actually using.
identified
So
seasonal changes in
you would
condition
have to
factor. That
correct
was in
those
regulatory area
weights
3A
for the
in the
time
Porlock
at
area,
spawning
and that was
anyway.
just exclusively
Well,
for
that's what the
females.
stock
I mean, we do
assessment
have the
does.
data for males, but
So
we haven't processed it yet.
I'm a bit concerned that
So,
you're
for
not
instance, we do not know
including
if
time
there's
of
a
year,
sex-specific
which
difference
in most
in
fish,
seasonal
at
changes
least
in
in
condition.
temperate waters,
But that was
has a
3A.
huge
As
impact on
far
the
as I
length-weight
know,
relationship.
we don't have any information on spawning groups out of regulatory area 3B. Oh, it's spawning. Yeah, I think areas spawning areas in 3A are better characterized than in 3B, but maybe other people here could correct me. Portlock area is probably the best known spawning area in the central Gulf of Alaska, and that's the one that we chose particularly to do the reproductive assessment project. So in terms of spawning production, probably 3A is probably more important than 3B.
Were devised to help account for those catchability differences. And we considered a range of different things, but really the only one that, well, two things stuck, and the most important of those is the hook competition standardization. And it's one of only two standardizations that we still apply to the index, the other being for the FIS timing relative to the survey, which we discussed, I think, reviewed again a few years ago, more recently than the competition adjustment. So the standardization for hook competition. So it's related to gear saturation and competition. So gear saturation, which catch rates decrease disproportionately to abundance if the sampling gear becomes fully occupied. Um, and so it may be present for different types of sampling gear, and for long-line gear, it's considered via competition via the finite number of hooks deployed. So don't just have competition, we don't have, just get saturation because of competition of other species, but we could have saturation or get close to all baits being taken because of competition among halibut for the same baits. So the IPHC method of standardization for hook competition was developed by Bill Clark in 2008 and is based on the number of baits removed on fish sets, BI, where I is predator species I. So it used to be a relationship, a standardization that was applied to the data aggregated across an entire regulatory area. But since the space-time model was implemented in 2016, we now apply this standardization at the level of survey station. So it's based on the Baranov catch equation, which is used to model the BI after a time period T. So BI being the number of baits removed, and the time being the soak time of the set. So after the set, the gear has been in the water for a period of time. We expect the baits removed to be a function of the initial number of, I know what I'm doing. Okay. The initial number of baits, the instantaneous rate of bait removal for predator I, and the sum overall, and Z is the sum of all FI over all predators. And Yep. Okay, so this is the Baranov catch equation for the number of baits removed on a fish set by a particular predator. Now, we're interested in halibut in particular, so it follows that the expected catch of Pacific halibut, which is one of the predators, is given by the same equation, where the H here now indicates halibut. Okay, oops, I'll go back a step. Sorry, I'm losing. I can't go backwards one animation step at a time. All right, so now here we're assuming soak time is of sufficient length that catches of all species are unaffected by the value of T. And so we arbitrarily set T equal 1. That would just be a scalar otherwise floating around in a relationship if we left T in there. And it was constant. And I understand our studies have, this is perhaps worthy of some discussion, but my understanding is from our past studies that this is a reasonable assumption. So the standardized index then for halibut is found by rearranging this equation and plugging in an estimator for Z. There we go, multinational letters. Okay, so by rearranging that, we get this estimator for FHAD, which is our standardized index. The instantaneous rate of bait removal by Pacific halibut becomes our index for Pacific halibut, corrected for competition. And so this B1 here is the final number of baits remaining. This is CPUE. It's the catch of halibut divided by the number of initial baits. And the rest of this is sorry, I've got this here. And this is the adjustment factor for each individual set. So for each individual set, we have our original CPUE, and then we have an adjustment factor depending on the level of competition. And this becomes our index. So these adjustment factors have a lower bound of 1, so it can only lead to an increase in weight per unit effort or numbers per unit effort. You can't have negative competition. The index will only go up. So back when this was originally devised, what Bill Clark did was he divided by the overall average annual level of competition for each regulatory, for the entire coast, and divided each regulatory area's adjustment factor by that, so that from year to year there was no change in competition, essentially, but everything was standardized to a scale that was more familiar to stakeholders. We weren't suddenly seeing catch rates that were double what people were familiar with, which would probably have caused confusion had that been done. It's really just a scale factor. It doesn't matter, but we when we moved to the space-time model, we preserved that by maintaining indices on a familiar scale by dividing by a scalar based on the mean adjustment for 1998. And the difference here is that this, by picking a single year's adjustment factor, compared to what they did prior to the space-time model being implemented, is that this allows the level of competition to vary over time throughout the coast. So you could have a year we could have a trend in competition coast-wide, and that will be reflected in the adjusted weight per unit effort values and numbers per unit effort values. So the mean adjustment factors can vary with the year, allowing for changes in predator density with time. We also know that missing baits on hauling are attributed to escaped predators other than Pacific halibut. So we're not assuming that halibut can take a bait. Sorry, we're assuming that halibut don't take the bait and without being captured. The adjustment is multiplicative, so zero catch rates of Pacific halibut remain as zeros after standardization. We can't manufacture fish using this adjustment. Even though you might think in areas of really high competition you get a zero, it might be because of competition. This adjustment can't create the fish that you might think are missing. Aggregating by area and year, generally 5 to 40% of baited hooks are returned with baits. And the method is mathematically the same as the multinomial exponential approach developed by Etienne and in a manuscript that I think remains technically unpublished, but a version from 2013 is available online, and you'll see it in the references. We actually met with Marie Etienne at around the time we were working on this, and took her method, not realizing at the time that they were equivalent, and tried to produce estimates from each method, and thought we'd done something wrong when they were exactly the same. And then we worked through the mathematics of it and thought, oh, okay, the Baronoff catch equation and the multinomial exponential approach have the same mathematical formulation. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but that helps provide some context perhaps. So what is this adjustment doing? Well, here's an example. This is area 2B in 2018, which I think was a year where there was fairly high competition with dogfish, particularly off the west coast of Vancouver Island here. So these are the adjustment factors that we get by station from the equation I just showed you previously. And so there's a lot of variation in these adjustment factors throughout the coast. And we see spatial aggregation in these adjustment factors. We get implying greater competition in quite localized parts of the halibut range, particularly off the coast of west coast of Vancouver Island, within the Salish Sea, and in the central part of the strait here. So these are the adjustment factors. This is the original unadjusted 032 weight per unit effort that we got from the survey. And basically no fish in the Salish Sea component. Relatively low densities here, and this higher density area is nevertheless also one of the areas where we had higher competition. And part of that competition is no doubt halibut competing with each other. Applying those adjustment factors, and you get this. So let's see if I can just click back and forth. So you can see those West Coast Vancouver Island stations generally going up. These stations in the central strait here going up as well. And some stations like this was the raw, pointing to this station off the southern tip of Haida Gwaii, and raw 032 weight per unit effort. That was the highest value. But adjusting for competition, there's actually less competition at that station. So relative to other areas, it's adjusted downwards. And so these competition effects are local, they're applied locally, and the result is a standardized 032 weight per unit effort and 032 numbers per unit effort. We use the same standardization for each from that equation. That's adjusted for the effects of competition. And that is what is input into the space-time model. There was also some discussion about hook timer studies, and which could inform us, provide useful information on the rate that baits are actually taken, which are assumed to have a very specific exponential form in the models that we're using for the competition adjustment. Historical work on hook timers, and there's quite a bit of work on this, was intended to produce data on exactly that, the rate of bait capture by Pacific halibut and competing species. And unfortunately, if you go back to those reports, which I've cited in the accompanying report for this presentation, those timers were not always effective, and in many cases, they were not tripped, and it appears that the timers were not sensitive to the capture of smaller fish or to smaller fish taking the bait without being captured. And so, as far as I can tell, they didn't produce particularly useful data or useful data at all for informing the adjustments that we're making. Fortunately, the IPHC is currently collaborating on a study of standard and modified circle hooks that will use hook timers to record the capture time of different species. And these modern hook timers are expected to be more sensitive than those used in historical studies, and hopefully will avoid the problems of the insensitive timers missing smaller fish, or smaller fish taking the bait without being captured. And it's therefore hoped that this study will yield data that will help inform the calculation of the hook competition standardization going forward. And so our only request is that you note the accompanying paper, but I'm interested in any discussion that, since it was a topic of discussion a year ago, any points of discussion you may have.
Yeah, it seems super useful. No, I just was saying that it looks like this would be something that's super useful to incorporate into the FIS assessment.
Yep, and just to make clear, that is what we are doing. This has been incorporated into the assessment, into the calculation since 2007.
Okay, not hearing any other comments, which is good since this is regular. It's been done for a long time and it's a regular thing. Yeah.
Could I just ask one question?
Sure. Yeah.
Since Ray, since this, I'm assuming that a similar adjustment is not made for the commercial catch. Is that correct? In similar areas?
No, they do. I mean, it does use the commercial CPUE in the stock assessment. So I'll let him chime in.
And as Ray notes, we do accommodate it in a more flexible way on the stock assessment. We, in fact, allow for catchability to change over time. So it doesn't carry the same kind of weight in the stock assessment that the FIS index does.
Thank you.
Well, a couple thoughts on that. One is, yes, we could certainly do a more complicated CPUE standardization. In fact, I had a student from the University of Washington, Cole Monahan, who worked with me in, I believe it was 2015 and 16. And we looked at ways to fit, in fact, a spatiotemporal model to the commercial fishery data to come up with a standardized index across different gear types, accounting for hook spacing and other factors. And although it was quite fruitful, at the end of the day, the conclusion by us and the SRB at the time was that it probably really wasn't worth the effort to maintain that on an annual basis,
Sure.
because essentially because the CPU was carrying less weight in the stock assessment. Certainly still interesting as a research project. We are limited in that we're working from commercial logbook data, and they're not recording the catch of other species. In fact, they're not even reliably recording the catch of sublegal halibut. And so we don't really have a good metric of the percentage of hooks that were occupied or the percentage of baits that came back. So this kind of detail is probably out of reach for the commercial data, although we certainly have considered doing more sophisticated standardizations to the basic CPUE data. We just haven't prioritized that as something to fit into the annual process.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. And Ray, thank you very much for doing this presentation. It's been super helpful for me since this is relatively new to me, and I'm not sure if it was of value to the rest of the group, but I really appreciated it.
Area 3A has had up to 6% of sets affected by whales, mainly sperm whales, and 4A is the area most affected by orca encounters, with over 10% of sets affected in some years and 12% of sets affected during the 2014 expansion station, the only time until 2021 that some of these stations are actually fished, so an important component of the estimation of the index for 4A through the space-time model. So these are potentially valuable data, so we wanted to know if we could make use of these data by making an adjustment for the effect of whale depredation. And so we did this in a very simple approach. We did look at a couple of other things, but this is what we came up with. We simply added covariates to the non-zero component of the space-time model. So if you recall, the space-time model has two components. We are modeling the process that generates zeros separately, but not entirely independently of the process that generates the non-zero data, to account for the fact that we essentially have a continuous process, but with a bunch of extra zeros stuck on there. And so here we're looking at adding covariates to the non-zero component of that. So when we catch halibut, is there an effect on that catch by the presence of orcas or sperm whales? And according to those criteria that you saw previously. So the covariates were simply binary variables taking the value 0 or 1. The value is 0 if the set was effective, so no assumed impact from whales or orcas, or 1 if whales or sperm whales or orcas were the reason for the set being marked as ineffective. And that could be either sperm whales or orcas or both, depending on the area we were looking at. Prediction of weight PNF or numbers PNF for the time series, though, is estimated with this covariate set to 0. So essentially, we're adjusting for the effect of depredation on those sets that were affected by whales, sperm whales, or orcas. So this allows us to include additional valuable data while accounting for the impact of these marine mammals on catch rates. And we do the same kind of thing when we've done exactly the same thing when we're comparing snap gear and fixed gear in the studies that we've been doing recently on the fish. Fish's fixed gear normally, and we're interested in potentially using snap vessels and future fishes to expand the range of charter boats available for the fish. So we've done some comparisons, and essentially in order to make use of the snap gear, we estimate the difference between the two gear types and then predict as if everything was fixed gear. So IPHC regulatory area is the area most affected by marine mammal interactions. Over the years since 1993, probably I don't think 4A was first sampled until 1998. In fact, we've had 139 orca affected sets and 3 sperm whale affected sets, so that's pretty tiny. But in some years, more than 10% of the sets affected by orcas, as noted earlier. The space-time model, when fitting that model with that covariate, the space-time model estimates that O32 weight per unit effort on affected sets is 51% of that of unaffected sets, with a 95% posterior credible interval of 43 to 60%. So it's reasonably precisely estimated. We have a fair number of sets, 139 over the years. So we can expect that the presence of orcas in particular, we did aggregate both species, but the presence of orcas is essentially halving the expected catch rate in regulatory area 4A. And if we compare, so here we've got a couple of comparisons to see what this is doing to the output of the model by having this covariate in here. So prior to this small study, I suppose, we excluded those 139 plus 3 sets. And that's indicated by the blue line, which is what we presented to the Commission at the annual meeting early this year. So refitting the model now with those data included, we get a very similar trend. It hasn't really affected the trend, indicating that the space-time model is doing a pretty good job at predicting in those missing ineffective stations. But we do see that see, I've got a note here. But we do see that the uncertainty has decreased. The posterior 95% credible intervals, those shaded regions, are narrow when we include those sets, noting that area 4A again is the area most affected by marine mammal interactions. Another interesting comparison is, well, what happened? How does this compare with what we were getting before we tightened the whale depredation criteria, and far fewer sets were being considered ineffective? And so the blue line in this case is the time series that when we last estimated that in 2018 before we tightened the criteria. And we see that that time series is lower than the one where we're including the whale sets but allowing for the difference between those sets and sets that aren't affected by whales, which, as you recall from the previous slide, is basically the same as in terms of the trend as excluding those sets. And that indicates that we did the right thing by excluding them. At the time, that was the right thing to do. There is evidence in the difference in those two curves of bias throughout the time series by including sets that are affected by whales without adjusting for the difference, without adjusting for the impact of those marine mammals. So this was all very nice and encouraging. We were doing the right thing by excluding them, but we can do a little bit better by including them and adjusting for the effect within the space-time model. So regulatory area 3A is the area most affected by sperm whale interactions. And I should note that there are most areas, these interactions are not a major factor in terms of the number of sets that are ineffective. So these are not random examples. These are the most important examples. So in area 3A, 116 sperm whale affected sets have been noted since 1993 in terms of sets deemed ineffective due to sperm whale interactions. We also have 29 orca-affected sets and 18 sets affected by both species. And in some years, more than 10% of sets are, that's a note from the previous one. It's supposed to be in some years, at least 6% of sets are affected by sperm whales in particular, or by marine mammals. So that's an error there, but excuse me. In this case, the space-time model, fitting the same space-time model, this time with separate covariates for sperm whales and orcas, because we have data on each. We estimate the impact to be much smaller than in 4A. That sperm whale affected sets, 86%, they have 86% of the catch rate of unaffected sets, and an orca affected sets, 84% of the catch rate. And with smaller sample sizes, the uncertainty is greater as well. So it's not too far off no effect here, where 100% would be no effect. But nevertheless, it may be worth including these covariates in the model and allowing these data to come back in. But the estimates from the space-time model tell us that really these sets are so few and the difference so small that their impact is actually negligible. So unlike in Area 4A, where we had improvements in uncertainty, these sets represent a much smaller proportion of sets. These affected sets are a much smaller proportion of total sets than in 4A, and the impact was much less. And so having them excluded and then predicting those values from the space-time model, or having them included and adjusted for, it really makes no difference. I'm still inclined to include them because I like having more data, especially if it seems that it's giving reasonable results. But in the absence of including them, and if we don't include them, the space-time model is still doing much the same thing in predicting at those sets. So nevertheless, our proposal is that beginning this year, data from ineffective sperm whale and orca-affected sets be included in the modeling with appropriate covariates to account for differences in catch rates between affected and unaffected sets. In IPHC regulatory areas where such interactions are rare, precise estimation of those covariates will not be possible, and we can continue to omit such sets from the analyses with little loss of information. Even in 3A, it's almost an example of one of those places where, although it looked like quite a bit of information was being lost, it was small in the grand scheme of things and the impact was less. But we've had some discussion this week about a third species, and that's sleeper sharks, which can have an impact, particularly in regulatory area 3B. And and the same process could be used going forwards for sleeper sharks. We're looking at revising the ineffectiveness criteria for those for that species as a first step. But then once we do that, we can look at estimating the effect of those species, so we're not excluding a large number of sets that are affected by sleeper sharks. So this is a pretty simple approach, but it works. And we're just asking you to note the paper, and if there's any, and recommend that we apply the approach going forwards.
Ray, this is Kim. Just a question. I think the data that you showed is pretty compelling, that it's worthwhile to add the information if it's possible to do it in a rigorous and standardized way. I'm just curious in terms of the criteria that you're using. Is this something that you can communicate to your vessel captains so that there's uniform compliance in their abilities to be able to recognize it when it occurs?
Thank you for the question, Kim. Yeah, in fact, those criteria are part of our standard manual for sea sampling. So it's our staff on the vessel that are I guess in conjunction with the folks working on the vessel. Again, Ian and Joseph can add information if I'm missing anything, but it's primarily our staff that are making the call on whether the criteria are met or not. So they're deciding whether they're ineffective or not, and so this, because we go through a training process with the staff, this should be something that's applied in a standard way across the board.
Hi, Ray.
But every year there are some sets in which there's some discussion over whether they're ineffective or not. And it was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday we had a meeting to discuss those sets. So we always try to ensure that these criteria are being applied consistently in the field. But where there's some question, we have a meeting with the FIS staff and Ian and myself to review any uncertainties in some of those sets.
Thank you.
Ray?
Add to this, but I know that it's not unusual for the sharks to actually get entangled in the gear, so their presence can be pretty obvious. But for more subtle aspects, Ian can
Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure it worked like that. Excuse me. I did look at the data more closely, and we did try models which had a random effect to allow for variation like that among the sets. But from my recollection, and I'll have to review it again. But I think in aggregate, we're noticing that impact greater in the areas of higher density. But it's something we can look at in more detail if there's concern that an average is perhaps insufficient. But noting that we are producing weight per unit effort estimates at the
Ray, are these sets still adjusted for hook competition?
Just a quick question
include them?
in terms of uncertainty. How many or what percentage of the total catch are these things applied to? Because obviously you use the sampled weights in the commercial data and the fish data, the fish data. This is a small
Okay.
percentage.
If we don't hear any other questions or comments. Oh,
I was just going to add that the sleeper shark depredation is quite characteristic. They often see damage to the fish, and as Ray mentioned, the sleeper sharks frequently get tangled in the ground line and/or captured or actually part the ground line. So when these interactions occur, it's generally quite characteristic, and the crew is pretty aware that they have encountered sleeper sharks. They can be 22 feet long too, so it's pretty good spectacle.
okay. Thank you, Ray, for all those updates.
Thank you. That was all I had.
That's plenty. Okay, it's 2:38. This session was section of the agenda was scheduled to end in a few minutes from now. Can I suggest that we take just this time here until 2:45 for a quick break? We do have a break coming up at 3:45, but I need one right now. Can we just
Good
take
for
5
me.
minutes while we do a handover from Ray to Ian? Okay, so we'll start back up at 2:45.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. So I'm going to provide you with a relatively brief update on the development of the 2021 stock assessment. And I'm going to begin with a little bit about the process, the recent assessments, and this is probably where we can talk some about the upcoming 2022 assessment as well. I'll talk through where I've been this year with regard to software updates. I'll address the SRB request from the previous SRB, and then I'll provide you just a sneak preview of a couple of data updates that have become available prior to the final data sets for this year. So to recap, and again, we've already touched on this topic, we last did a full stock assessment in 2019, and you will recall that not only did we have the standard SRB review in 2019, but we also contracted an independent peer review so that we had an additional set of eyes on the assessment and perhaps a little bit more in-depth dive than we're capable of doing in a normal 3-day SRB meeting. So that was conducted in 2019, and that full assessment, it was due. It had been several years since we had done a full assessment, but we also structured that full assessment around a very new and important data source, which was the commercial sex ratios at age. So we had never had that information, and we were able to generate 2 years of data and make that available for that full assessment. So in that case, we actually had to restructure the models a bit to estimate the relative selectivity of males and females in the commercial data, something we had not been able to do previously. Then in 2020, we did an update, and we updated the standard data sources, and we also added another year of commercial sex ratio at age. We did have a new data source that we didn't have previously, which was the recreational sex ratios at age. Thanks to Alaska Department of Fish and Game, particularly Sarah Webster, for working with me on generating sex-specific information from the data that they already had in hand. And so we were able to include that. That actually had very little effect on the overall assessment, but it was an important step in getting that information in and allowed us to use split-sex selectivity for the recreational fleet as well. So that was an improvement, but not really of the same magnitude of that change in 2019. So for 2021, we are planning another update to the stock assessment. We have the same standard data updates that we usually have, and in addition, we have one more year, which I'll show you in a few slides here, of commercial sex ratio at age 2020 to add to the assessment. Looking forward, and thanks to Anne-Marie for bringing up the issue of 2022. So you'll see that this is the second year since the full assessment. So following the guidelines that we have in place, which are that we will perform a full stock assessment approximately every 3 years or as needed. And so we had been anticipating doing a full assessment in 2022. And some of the things that we've been considering are the interaction between the stock assessment and the MSE process, not wanting to get too far out of phase between the two, but still noting that the MSE operating model has actually diverged substantially from the stock assessment in recent years as it's gone to a fully spatially explicit operating model. And so we don't necessarily need to be quite as coordinated and necessarily using the same models in both places. In fact, we don't want to. But we are cognizant that as we transition toward a management procedure, we don't necessarily want to have a whole brand new set of results coming in from the assessment at a time when the MSE process has not had a chance to incorporate whatever changes might be there. So we've been trying to coordinate that. In addition, in planning for 2022, we recognize that we don't have, as we did in 2019, a real key data source that will require restructuring the stock assessment model. We have yet to produce another, what I'll call a milestone product from the biological research program. Certainly, there is potential when we get to something like a revised maturity schedule or a new fecundity relationship that we will perhaps want to do a full assessment structured around that, should it change our perception of the way the stock is working. However, given that it's been 3 years, we have been planning to go to a full assessment in 2022. And some of the topics that I've already identified, and we've identified through the SRB process as well, that I would be interested in investigating. As Sven said, it's my chance to put the hood up and kick the tires a little bit. I certainly investigate further into data weighting, which we've been working on in the interim already. Things that I focused on in the previous assessment, such as the estimation of steepness and M, investigating coming out of the recent Kaplan workshop, evaluating whether perhaps age-dependent M, particularly for the youngest ages, might be warranted. Looking at whether or not the time series as it's grown for commercial sex ratio at age can support estimation of time varying selectivity in males and females in the commercial fishery. And also looking forward to things like climate change, perhaps reevaluating the treatment of the PDO as a covariate to recruitment, and or evaluating other environmental relationships as they potentially might be more or less useful than the PDO moving forward. And then, of course, as I did in the 2019 full assessment, also reconsidering and exploring a little bit the basic structure of the ensemble that we're using. So I realized that wasn't in the document, but I wanted to give you just a little synopsis of some of the things that I had on my list to evaluate in 2022. And I'm happy to discuss this now, or perhaps we can hold it as you see fit, whether you want to try to get through more of this presentation before Olaf has to go, or whether you want to have this conversation now and just see where we get to in the presentation. In that case, I'm happy to answer any questions about that, or continue on as you guys would like. Well, there were a couple of action items that we took care of right away. One example was updating the data weighting, the tuning process every year, regardless of whether it was a full or an update. So we implemented that right away coming out of the full stock assessment. And we've been doing that for the last few years, so tracking that. Data weighting, we've been continuing to explore that. I'm not sure we've found the silver bullet yet, but it's still something that I'm interested in evaluating. There were a range of other recommendations from the independent review, but I think we've mostly captured those here in the list that I've described. So I don't think that there's anything, at the moment, I don't feel like there's anything that we have to change in the stock assessment for 2022. I will also note that even during update assessments, I have been routinely conducting sensitivity analyses. So I conduct a retrospective analysis each year, and I've also conducted sensitivity analyses to try and highlight the necessity of some of the biological research that's been occurring. So I have, for example, shown a sensitivity to whale depredation, and I've shown a sensitivity to adjusted maturity schedule, or a maturity schedule that's actually shifting over time, perhaps due to temperature, climate change, or something else. And so, updated assessments don't preclude doing some sensitivity analyses and exploring these topics, but due to the compressed timeline, I certainly don't have the latitude to investigate a wide variety of things. And I wouldn't be making structural changes to the model as part of an update, because as you will all recall, by this meeting, we have essentially settled on the model structure. And so one of the recommendations I hope you'll make at this meeting is that we recommend using the 2021 stock assessment, acknowledging that I won't be going away and fiddling with the model for 3 weeks and making some sort of structural changes, that what we have is what we're going to be using for this year. And if I had structural changes to make, and we have made a few minor adjustments over the last few years, I would make those, show you guys the results of those changes at the June meeting.
No, not information as such, but the actual area of the dominant area of
the
spawning.
standard process is that we don't make any changes
Not
to the
in
assessment
terms of
structure
length, weight,
after this meeting.
just
All we do
where
is add
they
data
spawn.
for this year's stock assessment.
Yeah, I think in
Okay,
terms
well, maybe I'll
of
continue.
when the next full assessment comes, yeah, the topics that
Okay.
I guess we can discuss along the way here. So, okay, so I guess that's a signal to continue.
Okay, thank you. So there hasn't actually been a lot of model development this year. I did, as I reported to you in June, I did update the software to the newest synthesis version, and I disappointingly reported that the run speed had gone down, but I'm happy to report that a newer version in August, which is now, I think, caught up to a newer version of 80 Model Builder, has actually brought the run times back to where we were in the previous version. So we're running to keep pace here, but we're at least back to the same speed of models that we had last year, which is nice. And we're using the new version. The great thing about the software updates this year is that none of the features that we use in the Halibut model changed, so the results were identical. All this does is set me up to better keep up with the software. If there are further changes in the future, I don't have to catch up multiple versions, which is nice. Other than that, we've made no structural changes to the stock assessment model since the 2020 stock assessment. So I'll move now into the request that you gave me at SRB019, which was to provide an analysis of annual surplus production and how that relates to the actual harvest in a particular year. And since you only gave me one request, I gave you 5 different ways to do it. Hopefully that's enough. I couldn't come up with number 6. So the 5 ways that I looked at this were, one, I recalled all the way back to, I forget now if it was 2013 or 14, when we actually fitted some surplus production models directly. I did 2 different flavors of the standard surplus production a la Hilborn and Walters. And then I've also got a couple examples from recent decision tables and the data overview document of other ways that we have presented surplus production and or a stock assessment model free evaluations of harvest intensity. So I'll step through each of these and show you what I found. It was in fact 2000, sorry, we just went on screensaver here in the, there we go. No, it's back. I'm presenting off my laptop, so our big screen just went dead. We're back. So it was actually 2014. In 2014, we investigated not just catch at age models, but we actually fit a VPA, and we fit several flavors of strict surplus production models. I'm pretty sure I used ASAP, if I remember correctly, although it was a few years ago. And what we concluded from that exercise was several things. One, surplus production models don't work very well for Pacific halibut. Most of the variability we've seen in the time series is due to big recruitments coming and going. And since we have a weak stock recruit relationship, there's very little relationship between the standing biomass and the productivity at any given time. We're also had at that point and still have a relatively short survey index relative to the full time series. And so we concluded at that point, A, ASAP isn't a great platform, and B, fitting surplus production models just to the survey data was not terribly useful at that time in the context of providing tactical assessment advice. The second way that we addressed the request this year, again, it was following just the standard surplus production calculation in Carl Walters, in Hilborn and Walters, which is the biomass last year accounting for the catch. The change to the biomass this year is the surplus production. So the challenge here is that we have multiple fleets. Each one has a different selectivity curve, and those selectivity curves change over time. And so historically, the commission used this concept of exploitable biomass, and we calculated basically harvest fractions of the exploitable biomass in any particular year. But that concept really broke down when we ended up with models that had multiple fleets with time-varying selectivity. And so this was one of the main reasons why we transitioned into using the spawning potential ratio, is so that we didn't have to try to create some exploitable biomass that didn't really match with any of the fleets in the model, and had fish that were maybe harvested by some but not by all. In addition, the other challenge that we have is that the IPHC's current interim management procedure is not actually designed around a stable biomass. And so you can imagine if you have a case where the stock is going down and our interim management procedure is applying a constant fishing intensity, then surplus production is useful to consider, but it's not actually what's driving the harvest advice in any particular year. And so I have in recent years been kind of threading the balance between presenting surplus production as a measure of what's going on in the stock, but also trying not to confuse stakeholders that an increasing or a decreasing stock is necessarily a good or a bad thing with regard to the performance of the management procedure. I think that's something maybe we can talk about that a little bit more at the end, when we look at the performance in recent years around the decision table. So the first calculation, I took the biomass from the stock assessment. So this is not assessment model free. It's just another way to look at the output. The next two graphs have the actual mortality is a black line, and the bars represent the surplus production. In this slide, this is estimated as a function of all the ages in the stock assessment. So we know this is including some fish that are younger than most of the fleets can access. The challenge being that we have, for example, bycatch mortality in non-directed fleets is catching fish as young as age 2, where the directed fishery is not actually retaining these fish until they're on average at least 8 or 9 years old for females and perhaps 10 or 11 years old for males. So we have some biomass included here that is not actually part of the surplus production. However, that said, the prominent feature in this graph is the big gap in the middle there, where the harvests were far greater than the surplus production, as calculated by all ages. And that reflects a time period when the stock was declining very rapidly. It was, we estimate, declining very rapidly because a huge pulse of recruitment from the 1980s was working its way through and had largely died both through natural causes and through fishing effects. What's also interesting at the end here is that you see at the end of the time series those two bars for I'm sorry, I'm actually having trouble. There's two bars for 2019 and 2020, which exceed the actual yield. Those are the years in which you start to see the largest increase in biomass of the recent 2011 and 12 cohorts. So those are appearing in this graph as additional surplus production, even though they're not fully recruited yet to the directed commercial fishery. So then, realizing that this was interesting but perhaps not 100% satisfying, I did a second calculation where I did used the same equation, but now used the spawning biomass estimate from the stock assessment. And of course, the scale changes. It becomes closer to the same scale as the yield. And in some regards, this is more consistent with the use of reference points in the current management procedure. It also, I think, it's a little bit smoother plot because you're dealing with an older age group, so recruitment variability is smoothed out to some degree. But you still see the same feature, which is that period in the early 2000s when the stock was declining rapidly, the actual yields were exceeding the surplus production pretty substantially for about a decade or more in there. And you also see at the end of the time series, beginning in 2018, that again the yield is the actual yield is exceeding the surplus production. And again, this corresponds to a period of decreasing stock trend from roughly 2017 onward. So I think that this is perhaps a little bit easier to digest, although again recognizing that the spawning biomass is not exactly analogous to what is available to all of the various fisheries in a particular year. But both of these things provide a similar perception on the stock. The fourth approach that we took to evaluating surplus production was actually something that we've already been doing. So this is a snapshot of just a couple of the top section of each of the harvest decision table from last year's stock assessment. And so just to reorient you, across the top are management alternatives, and down the left are various metrics of stock trend and stock status. And what's reported in the table is the probability that each of those metrics occurs, whether the stock is declining, whether it is going to go below either the 30 or 20% reference point. So the contents of this table are perhaps not so important. What I wanted to highlight here is the column that I've now circled in purple, which is a column that we introduced into this table approximately 3 years ago. And this has a slightly different interpretation than the surplus production, the annual surplus production I've been showing you in the previous slides. This table projects out 3 years. And so this particular column shows the yield that would produce a 50% chance of the same or greater spawning biomass at the end of the 3-year projection. So we've called this, variously, we've called this the 3-year surplus or the break-even line. But this is intended to provide the users of this table with a reference. Like, okay, if I wanted to take the same yield for the next 3 years and not end up with a lower spawning biomass with at least a 50% chance, this is the yield that I could take. And all I really want you to take away from this here is that the status quo and the F43 columns, which are highlighted with the additional headers there and are to the right of the 3-year surplus, were all substantially in excess of that 3-year surplus. And so that's what we've been describing to the Commission over the last several years is, okay, you're applying your F43 policy and it is substantially greater than the 3-year surplus. Therefore, you should be expecting, with a relatively high probability, that the spawning biomass is going to continue to decline over the next 3 years. And so we've been routinely reporting this type of this column in the decision table for the last 3 years. I went back, and this is something that I haven't presented to the Commission, was that I went back into each year's stock assessment all the way back into 2013, and I made that same calculation. You'll note here that the yield is both total yield and TCEY, because it wasn't until 2018 that the Commission moved into using TCEY in the table. So for just to jog your memory, TCEY is all of the mortality sources except the U26 non-directed discards. So the little tiny fish that are caught in non-directed fisheries are treated differently because they're going to be moving around substantially more than the rest of the demographics before they actually enter any of the directed fisheries. That change was made in 2018. So I also added the total yield on here. You can see that the two track each other quite closely, but that allowed me to extend this relationship back. And sure enough, when you look back into 2015 and 16, in those years when the 3-year surplus was pretty close to what we were actually taking out of the stock, those correspond to years when we estimate in the stock assessment that the stock was actually increasing gradually over that time period. And so this is not a retrospective look. These were actually pulled out of each year's stock assessment. So it shows you the consistency we've seen in recent stock assessments. And then it also highlights this gap in recent years, which we have been describing to the Commission each year, which is that the yields that have been set in each of these years have substantially exceeded what we project as the 3-year surplus. And I think my next slide Oh, sorry. I'll get back to the commission's decision on that, I think, in my concluding slides to this section. The final approach that we took, this is going perhaps a little bit far afield from surplus production, but I think that one of the things that you were interested in with a calculation of surplus production is to provide a model-free, or at least an assessment model-reduced look at what's going on in the stock. And this calculation of empirical harvest rate is something that we introduced, I believe it was maybe even as early as 2016, as a way to look at the relative exploitation rates without using any stock assessment model. And to be honest, Alan and I thought this was going to sort of catch on and be quite a bit of interest to people when we introduced it, and I think nobody's ever even asked us a question about it since. It really hasn't caught on to people's interest, but nonetheless, we still think it's quite interesting, and it's really just the ratio of the catch to the survey index with an arbitrary constant to provide continuity across coastwide and regional levels. So the challenge here is that it's completely model-free, but it means that we don't really know what the scale is. But this figure shows you the time series, and I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to fit the years on the x-axis, but the x-axis here within each region and coast-wide is actually the time series from 1993 to 2020. And so these are all on the same scale. So again, this is the ratio of the catch to the survey index. And it's standardized arbitrarily such that the coastwide index is a value of 1 in the terminal year. We actually used this approach to characterize the fishery on average over several years a few years ago, and that's why we have parameterized it with K in here rather than just saying you're dividing by the value observed in the most recent year, because we actually used a 3-year average at some time period. But what this calculation allows you to do is to see that time period in the mid-2000s corresponds to this big, oh, nice. My laptop just restarted. So I'll just switch over, and maybe, Steph, if you could make the boardroom the presenter, I'll just switch over here. Sorry. Nice, I think I just got a pushed update on my laptop. Okay, so continuing on. So let me get my pointer here.
The hand one to the left. Oh.
Yeah, so what I want to call your attention to is this peak in exploitation rate here corresponds to the mid-2000s, and that corresponds to that time period over which we estimate that the surplus production was being exceeded greatly by the actual yield, and in fact the stock was decreasing quickly. And then you see that come down and then increase a little bit at the end, again consistent with this time period when we've been exceeding the surplus production in the stock. The other nice thing I think about this calculation is it provides some resolution in terms of the relative harvest rates across regions as well. So each of these biological regions, you can quickly see that historically we have been exploiting region 2 at a much higher rate, but all of these regions show that same pattern of higher relative empirical harvest during the early 2000s, a decrease, and then an increase at the end of the time series. And again, this is completely stock assessment model free. This is dependent only on the index from the stock assessment and the actual mortality that was observed. So even if nobody else has noticed, we think this is an interesting and useful calculation, and I thought it was close enough to surplus production that we would put it in here. So our conclusions from this analysis, one, this picture about what was going on in the early 2000s, and again in the most recent few years, is fairly clear. The stock declined pretty rapidly during that time period, and it was driven by the fact that we were exceeding the surplus production. I mean, those two things, you can put them in either order. It's a chicken or the egg. They're both happening at the same time. As I mentioned when I talked about the decision table, the Commission has made an explicit choice in the last few years, effectively, to fish down the stock. Over 2017 to 2020, they were using an F46 policy, and each year it was acknowledged in the decision table that there was a high probability of further stock decline if they used an F46 policy. In 2021, they increased the harvest rate to an F43, and there was greater than 60% chance of further decline in spawning biomass over the next 1 to 3 years. So this choice has been explicit to exceed the surplus production in these years. And I'll note that this is where I think we need to be careful with the concept of surplus production, because this choice of fishing intensity was heavily informed by the MSE analyses that have been going on, testing that level of fishing intensity in the short term and in the long term, and finding that although it will cause the stock to go down under some conditions, over the long term, it is a sustainable and it is a level of fishing intensity that meets the objectives that have been set forward. So again, to conclude, we find that surplus production is a useful concept, and it's helpful to remind the decision makers where we are in relation to surplus production. But it's also sometimes a challenge to make sure that that's kept separate from the consideration of a management procedure that is fully tested through the MSE platform. Perhaps I'll pause there to see if there are any questions before I move into some of the data updates.
Is probably worth some discussion. Either I've misunderstood there, or I worry that the MSC is giving false confidence in the future performance of these pretty aggressive harvest decisions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Olaf. If I could respond briefly, it's a fair paraphrase, but I have actually pulled up quite short of saying don't worry about it. We have definitely highlighted to the decision makers that if they want to stabilize the stock at current levels, that they will have to reduce the harvest to do so. That's been very clear over the last several stock assessments. And we are, in fact, in a period when we have 2006 through 2010 were much lower recruitments than we have seen in the historical time series. And so we are actually right now experiencing a deficit in productivity as a function of those years, those consecutive years of low recruitment, which has corresponded to some stock declines. However, the stock is currently estimated to be at B33%. And our overall estimates are that BMEY would be somewhere around 36%, and that has so far emerged as I think we can call it a target now from the MSE analyses of wanting to keep the stock at or around B36%. So although we are currently exceeding the surplus production, there have not been I guess we're not at the point where we would throw up huge red flags to indicate that we are at a stock condition that is approaching a conservation concern. So we wouldn't say the stock is approaching an overfished condition if we were to use a term like that at this point. Although we certainly are cognizant that we need to be considering this essentially run of low recruitment, which has led us to fairly low productivity currently. Yeah, Alan.
I just wanted to add too that part of the
Yeah,
MSE testing incorporates that 30-20 control rule, which is a really steep decline in fishing intensity if the stock does drop below 30%. So the part of this MSE suggestion, don't worry about it, is the harvest policy will start to act when the stock does get to those levels of concern.
So
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
more.
It's a little bit complicated because it brings in the environmental regime. So it models the environmental regime, which is autocorrelated. So that regime has an average of 20 to 40-year period. And so we're currently in a low regime. So in the short term, it is modeling that the recruitment on average is coming at a low level. But that could switch easily in the next year or two to a high level regime. And then within that regime, it just draws from a log normal distribution. But it is switching between regimes with periods of high and low. But I'll bet 5 to 10 years into the projections, it's starting to get pretty even high and low recruitment regimes.
I think that's not an unreasonable way of going about it, but it's one that's essentially placing a bet on these recent low productivity conditions being a temporary departure from the long-term mean, and then the management is the management being based on the MSC is also taking that bet and saying, we believe that's what's going to happen too, and so we're not worried about these high fishing levels in the short term, because essentially it'll rebound at some point.
Yeah, and Ian and I have both presented MSE and assessment as strategic and tactical thinking for the commission to consider both aspects of it.
Great. Yeah, I don't need to go into this anymore, but I thought this was really, really informative and in some ways kind of worrisome. And I think it would be good for the SRB to flag this as well.
if I could add something, yeah, the thing that I get from this is pretty much, out of the 5 ways you looked at it, most of the ways show, more of a concrete as you say, a deliberate choice to fish down the stock, and it's not kind of abstract, like the F46, F43% and fishing intensity. Those things are, pretty abstract for people, and this makes it just a little clearer. And then, of course, the intent. I'm not comfortable saying. I think what was implied by some of Olaf's questions and comments that, well, the MSE says it's all right. Well, don't trust the MSE, because like where do you go from there? The point of the MSE was to test these things and provide basically some information on how these things are expected to perform. So you have to be, and I think I tried to point this out earlier, that you can't ignore the short to medium term. You can't ignore the license lifetime of a fisherman, because if you're talking, yeah, this thing performs great over 250 years, well, nobody cares. Because that is where that would be somewhat misleading, because there's a risk that they're aiming to fish the stock down to be 36%, and they overshoot it, and recruitment doesn't come back. Like, those risks are there. So I'm not sure. I don't remember. I mean, you have a lot of metrics that you guys have used for the MSE, but to me, this just reinforces that, yeah, you're taking this deliberate choice to fish the stock down, which is fine, but make sure that your MSE is actually reflecting risk metrics
really
properly.
quickly. The sleeper sharks, presumably, they leave a different bite mark, because unlike mammals, they don't come to the surface. So how would you observe their presence?
As Alan points out, you may hit that stock, that harvest control rule, and it's going to have some harsh reality. And so I think you just have to make sure that your MSC is communicating those things clearly, the risk, not just, the average kind of performances.
And the other question was, sorry, Ian, just briefly,
reconcile these two concepts is to help
50%
remind people that
of impact
there's an
on
envelope
CPE.
of
Would you
potential
expect that to be
futures that are modeled in the
independent
MSE.
of
We are only on one
the total
actual
abundance?
and our actual trajectory right
I
now
mean,
is at a
I would
fairly
expect
low point
to
relative
see
to
that a
overall
pod
envelope
would become satiated, a pod of orcas would become satiated, so large sets
help
would
people
probably have a much lower predation rate than small sets,
but in fact, at present,
which
we are actually
then
quite low
has a problem
relative
when
to that
either the
overall
abundance of
envelope. And if
orcas
they
or the
want to stabilize
abundance
the stock, here are
of
the tactical choices that they would have to make in the short term
halibut
to do that,
changes in your model.
regardless of where they might be in the long term.
Yeah, and that should be reflected in your probability statistics, which is what I mean. Just the worst thing that we've ever done in MSE is show medians of trajectories. The big thick black line going down the middle. Because that's not what's going to happen. It's not even real. It's not even a realistic representation of what's going to happen. It's the average of all those individual trajectories that you're talking about. So they're really misleading that way, and hopefully, people are aware of that, and I don't know if you kind of adjust your communications going forward to emphasize that, and maybe don't even show it. Show the spaghetti lines instead. That, yeah, you're on one of these, or and to get people thinking that way.
As Sean was saying, that there has to be a strong emphasis on communicating the uncertainty here, and there's sort of this parameter uncertainty that
Yeah.
I cut Ian off. If you can let him finish.
And this
Yeah, I
isn't
mean-
my area, this is Kim, but I don't think the past is any prediction of the environmental future that these fish are living in. So for a model to say, well, there could be autocorrelation, but it, in the future it has, some probability of being better and some not, I don't think so. But that, again, is my uninformed opinion.
Well, I think it's true. I mean, I think
right.
that's the way you have to
Thank
look
you.
at it, is that the past isn't a great projection of the future, but I mean, a stock gets to low abundance for a reason, um, and you just want to make sure that your MSE doesn't ignore that. If recruitment appears autocorrelated, then you have to model it as autocorrelated. You can't assume it's going to jump back to the mean that in your first projection year. So I think I think what you guys are doing is consistent with what Kim is saying. In the long term, it's certainly less predictable the further out you go. But what we've seen for most of in Canada anyway, a lot of the assessments that we've done is that, like our herring fisheries, our salmon stocks, herring stocks, when they go through low productivity, they sit in it for sometimes long periods. But I think you guys are representing that pretty well with the autocorrelation in your recruitments.
Yeah, but the autocorrelation has multiple parts. The autocorrelation is you have low stock abundance, which means you have low recruitment, right? And then there is potentially autocorrelation in the abiotic component, which is less predictable. And that could be a real major driver, which could be directionally moving in a direction that is not consistent with improved stock recruitment in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, the autocorrelation in the MSC is still assuming stationary.
In the long term, I would assume. Or
Yeah, by stationary, do you mean just the recruitment average in the recruitment distribution itself and the average recruitment? Yeah, that's a consistent one, but it has a random probability of being high or low, basically. But on average, it just averages out. It's just a source of uncertainty. One thing we have done in the past, I was just going to say, one thing we've done in the past is done projections with just low levels of recruitment or just high levels of recruitment to show the contrast between those two scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one other thing to do is something that the Mid-Atlantic does a lot, the Mid-Atlantic region of the U.S. does a lot, which is do projections based on just recent recruitments. So, drawing from a distribution that's defined by the past 10 years recruitment in cases where you seem to have a declining recruitment trend, like this one. One last thing I wanted to say here about the that control rule, which is the same rule, but if you essentially truncate the low harvest mortalities in some way that's sort of defined by past experience. Say if we followed this control rule, but in practice we never went below our lowest Fs in the reducing phase of the control rule, this is how it would perform. And my guess is those really aggressive control rules would perform badly if you never hit the brakes hard and only hit the accelerator hard. So I think that might sort of give them religion a little bit and say like, okay, if we want to pick this control rule, you got to follow both the ups and downs, or otherwise it performs quite poorly.
Yeah, I see Sven might be having some issues. But just to respond quickly to that, and you can see it as either fortunate or unfortunate, but the IPHC has never experienced a year where the assessment estimated stock status below 30%. So we don't have any empirical data on how they may follow that control rule and what these lowest Fs may be. Good or bad, however you want to view it.
No, absolutely, and I assumed that was the case. I think you just have to, show it. If you didn't, if you only went half as far in the low direction, this rule doesn't actually perform very well. If you didn't follow this rule, but a rule that truncates the low Fs, you're not gonna perform well. You got to hit the brakes hard and the accelerator hard.
Yeah, and that's a great idea to really show. There's a lot of interest in implementation variability, and this is a great example to show in what happens if there's some sort of implementation variability.
Yeah.
Can anyone hear me now?
Oh, we got you now.
Oh,
You're back.
what a stupid program. I assume
Ian's
you've
computer
answered all
restarting
my
and-
question.
Yes, we've
Yeah,
already answered your question, Ben.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Ian that I like this. It's a very nice way. If you'd found a sixth one, you could have had another paper out of it, I'm sure. But I think what strikes me about all of these is they all have different purposes. And the way that they're being used isn't normally the way, well, the information they're trying to display, and I think that's the real problem. So I think it's a communication issue. I do think the one that you have that is model free, I think could be something that one could derive some exceptional circumstance from, something that we discussed where some of this surplus production stuff came from, our request came from. When that runs out of the rudder, you can then call an exceptional circumstance because it uses the survey index and the catch. And if that's very different, that ratio from the stock assessment, then you may have an issue.
Yeah, thanks, Sven. I like that idea.
So I think from maybe something that we might recommend as an SRB, we can talk about this later, but maybe you guys can comment on it now. We all seem to like this. One of the things, and I think we've all kind of agreed that as a communication tool idea, it's effective. And just one of the things that, I'm sure when you're up there presenting F46 and F43% and fishing intensity at the annual meeting, there are a good percentage of people, probably like 80%, that have no idea what you're talking about. They might get the concept, of fishing intensity high or low, but the details of what is the difference between these two F43, F46, like my experience talking to fishermen and even some managers, when we get down to it, is like, wow, I really did not understand what you were saying, and not understanding each other. So this just, to me, provides a way to provide that that reality check. It's something that everybody should at least get be aware of. So, and maybe when it comes down to really hard choices, if as you're getting closer to where things might kick in, some of these things will become even more important down the road. So I think maybe to continue thinking
I
about
think
it. And go ahead.
Alan also mentioned when he was I think it was a couple of meetings ago, trying to explain to the MSC, the MSAB, I think it was, the short-term versus the long-term trade-offs that are being made by certain choices. And I think that's exactly this, isn't it? If there was some way we could classify that into a short-term versus long-term risk, then that might give them an idea of how close they're stepping to the cliff.
You could probably even pull something like this as a metric out of your MSC simulations. You could look at how different procedures manage the surplus production as well. Okay. Again, that was really informative, and I think we'll have a chat about it later to see if there's anything we want to request or anything going forward. Where are we? 3:45. Yep.
Yeah, did you want your actual break here before I continue on to the next section?
How long is your next section?
Probably not more
Another
than
45 minutes.
15 minutes without questions.
If it's okay with everyone, I think powering through for 15 minutes and then see how it goes, I think.
I promised to break my computer again, so there won't be any more questions.
Well, I've actually had time to restart my laptop during the questions here, so I'm ready to go. Okay, I'll go ahead into the next section. This is just some very preliminary data updates. This is an opportunity to provide any heads up about what we see. We don't have a lot of preliminary data yet at this time of the year. In some historical years, we've had the SRB meeting a little bit later in the fall, and we've had a lot more preliminary data. At this point, I don't have a ton to show you, but I did want to give you a heads up on the commercial fishery sex ratios, which I'm happy to report the Joseph's program moved incredibly fast through this genetic analysis this year and produced these in August, which gave me time to actually aggregate them and provide them for this meeting in time for the presentation. So I think it's a good illustration of how we have really improved the efficiency of the genetic assay and the process of getting those samples from the commercial fishery, the port samplers in the field through the genetics lab. And they're really provided me with very timely data, which has extended the time series that I have to work with by 25% this year. So this first panel is the portion female by each of the biological regions, and on the left is the coast-wide average. So you can see that this year's data suggest, again, noting that this is 2020, not 2021. We lag 1 year in the analysis of the genetic information, that this commercial fishery is approximately 80% female in its landings, which is, not atypical for a flatfish species with highly dimorphic growth, but it's definitely something that we have to get correct in the stock assessment if we want to describe things like spawning potential ratio and relative spawning biomass. We definitely need to know this, and we saw that quite strongly in the 2019 stock assessment, how important these data were to our estimates of overall scale and productivity of the stock. To put this in context, here are the last 3 years of data. And one thing that's really confidence inspiring to me is that the patterns that we see are very consistent over time. Region 4 is consistently the highest proportion female, and Region 4B, interestingly enough, right next door out in the Aleutians, is consistently the lowest percent female. And so this gives me some confidence that what we're getting is really reflective of what's going on in the population. I also provide the table here so that you can see the actual values associated with these. And one thing in particular stands out to me. We had been seeing a trend downward over 2017 to 2019 from over 80% in Region 3 down to 76%. And then we saw that jump back up to 81% in 2020. And I've just started exploring some bootstrapping analyses of these data to essentially evaluate what level of change we would attribute to being significant or of interest and what is just inherent in the sampling variability. So that's something that's ongoing, and it's something I'm interested in. But I'll go to the next slide here. The next slide shows you the proportions, the sex ratio at age by each of these regions. So it's a little bit more detailed information. And I think this also provides the explanation for what we're seeing in Region 3 in 2020, which is that we have 2 younger year classes coming in. And we're seeing the catch composition in Region 3 shifting from older fish, which have a lower proportion female, to younger fish as this 2011 and 2012 year class coming in. So again, I'm quite encouraged that these data seem to be very consistent with what we're seeing, what the results from the stock assessment model and the sex ratio at age and the age compositions themselves that we're getting in the setline survey all seem to be painting a similarly coherent picture. I will note, you probably have already noticed that Region 4B is clearly more variable. Even though it's a lower fraction female, it's also got a lot more variability year to year and age to age. Part of that, I don't have the table included here, but it's based on a relatively small sample size. So where we're looking at around 100 commercial trips or more in most biological regions, in 4B, this is only representing between 10 and 20 commercial fishing trips per year. So we would expect to see more variability there. And that's what's led me to start building an approach where I can bootstrap these data to essentially be able to put some confidence intervals on these estimates and better delineate between the signal and the noise. And I'll go back to this last slide here and just highlight that we agreed when we began this sampling program to get several years of data in hand before we got to the point where we started to evaluate a longer term perspective. Do we need to do the genetic assays every year? What kind of variability do we see region to region versus year to year? And is that variability meaningful? And I would say that we're starting to get to that point. One thing that I would be planning to explore over the next couple of years is exactly that, is whether or not there is potentially some benefit in skipping a year in this sampling or in the genetic assays themselves, or whether we could reduce the sample size and get a similar precision out of these estimates, or whether we really need what we're getting. And in fact, if we want to estimate the sex ratio, the relative selectivity in the assessment model, and allow that to change over time to reflect real patterns in the fishery, then perhaps we're going to have to continue with a pretty stout data collection program in order to support that parameter estimation. So this is one of the avenues that we're exploring over the near to medium term, is to continue to refine how we use these data exactly what level of resolution we need now that we have a few years in hand to start to see that there are some interesting patterns here.
Ian, I have a question. This is Tim. So you had an age that went down to 8 years old. Are those fish still O32 class fish that are harvestable class, or are those U32 fish?
Yeah, that's correct. So these are still all legal fish. So our commercial port samplers are only sampling the catch that's brought to port. So this will only include O32s. We do get sex ratio information. We get comprehensive sex ratios at age from the FIS survey. And I've actually, I think years ago, presented some of that information to the SRB. But this is really not so much about describing the population as getting the demographics of the mortality occurring due to the fishery correct in the stock assessment model.
Right.
So the next one is really quick, and it's because it's still in process. I had hoped, of course, I knew that Ray was working on whale depredation in the FIS survey analysis, and that opens the door for some additional analysis on the commercial side. So one avenue that has been taken for sablefish in Alaska to account for whale depredation in the commercial fishery is to use independent information to evaluate the effect of whales when they're occurring. For example, the coefficients that are coming out of the FIS model, and then to use fishery-dependent data, such as logbooks or observer data, to determine what level of catch is being affected when the whales, or sorry, to determine the frequency at which the commercial catch is being affected. And so I had hoped to be able to have some frequency of interaction summary for this meeting. It's still ongoing because it's the first time we've used this aspect of the logbook data. And it turns out we have some challenges with the way it's being reported and imported into our databases. And I want to make sure that I get it right before I start to put those results out there. But the medium-term goal here is to be able to characterize how frequently the commercial fishery is interacting with whales, and then to use the estimates that we're getting of the effect of the whales on the catch from the FIS to essentially come up with an estimate of the amount of whale depredation that we would attribute to the commercial fishery, and then look toward perhaps incorporating that into the mortality that we use in the stock assessment, such that we are better accounting for this mortality, which, although it's whales, is really not natural mortality. It's really mortality that's associated with the fishing process. And again, I'm kind of following the model that's been used for sablefish in Alaska and probably other species in other places. But that's the goal of this analysis. And unfortunately, I just don't have the preliminary data completely unambiguously straightened out from the logbooks to yet provide you with a summary. But I did want to just tell you where I'm planning to go with that. This last slide is just the normal laundry list because you are essentially signing off on the assessment structure and the data that I plan to put in it. I wanted to provide you with a better list of the things that I will add to the preliminary 2021 stock assessment before it's finalized for this year's management process. And I'll just note that there is nothing on this list here that differs from what I added to last year's stock assessment, other than the years in which are being affected. So anything that was preliminary in 2020 gets updated to what are now effectively final values, and anything that we've collected in 2021 will get incorporated into this year's stock assessment. So this is just that list so that you have it at your fingertips for report writing and or just consideration. And then this presentation, I'm recommending that you note this paper, which provides the response to the requests from the last SRB and an update on where the assessment model is, which is obviously quite easy because we haven't made any structural changes. Recommend anything if we needed to make a change for this year's assessment, and then, considering our earlier discussion, provide any requests for further analyses or things you would like to see at SRB20, which will be next June. And that concludes my presentation. So Yeah. So those are one of the things we would do in a full stock assessment. So I would provide a full set of diagnostics, both in the printed material as well as what I did last time was to provide the electronic file so you could actually scroll through all the output at your convenience. What we have in the past done is reserve the option for a special SRB meeting in December, and we have used a few of those. The idea, especially in the early years were, before the assessment was as stable as it is now, we wanted to reserve an additional meeting for if anything popped up. Like, for example, if I throw the new data in and something completely unexpected happens, we wanted to have the ability to have another check-in with the SRB. We have intermittently had a December check-in. In the last couple of years, we've not had any unexpected issues pop up that we haven't caught in the earlier meetings and earlier process. I do field requests for additional diagnostics, and I do provide a more extensive stock assessment document. It doesn't, with 4 models, it doesn't include the fit to every data source, but it does include a greater description. It includes the retrospectives and the sensitivities and other things, and that's posted in advance of the annual meeting. I will also note that on request, the science advisors and others have asked to see more detailed output from the stock assessments in some models, and of course that's always available. I also post, prior to the annual meeting, I post both the assessment document, an extensive data overview document, which is, I think, around 60 or 70 pages now, which provides detailed graphics and things for various data sets, as well as the input files for the stock assessment are posted on the website. So previous year's assessments are available now, and this year's assessment will be available as we approach the annual meeting. So there are some opportunities for you all to check in on how things are going, essentially, before the annual meeting occurs.
So going way back to the beginning, we do have a full assessment coming up, which would be this time next year.
It would actually be June of next year. So I would conduct the full assessment even prior to having the data.
I'm trying to anticipate like what we might. Yeah. Trying to anticipate what we might want to request in terms of that stock assessment, but it's hard because we don't. Maybe either we think about that December meeting, maybe a short one that we can get a look at the assessment diagnostics and things, how they're coming out, so we can come up with more specific requests rather than I mean right now it would be fairly vague, I think.
I would suggest that,
or another option would be to just put around the annual meeting.
I would say perhaps 2 things. One, looking at the results of this year's assessment around the annual meeting, and also looking back to the 2019 stock assessment and the diagnostics that were provided there. I will not have the ability to provide a document that includes the full diagnostics in December. I'll be able to walk you through any surprises, but part of the reason we're on this process is just the compressed nature of the schedule. So I think both the full 2019 assessment as well as the extended document for the annual meeting would be a good place to consider what requests you might have for June. And I think we could certainly, I won't be starting development on the 2022 assessment until after the annual meeting. And so there's certainly time there to accommodate any further requests the SRB would have post-annual meeting.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Olaf. I think in a tactical sense for this year's assessment, no. But looking forward to the next assessment, one thing that I would like to consider is the way in which we use the PDO. So right now we have a single environmental covariate on recruitment, and we treat the PDO as a binary variable. So when the PDO is in a positive phase, it's a 1, and when it's in a negative phase, it's a 0. And we estimate a coefficient that describes a multiplicative coefficient that describes the effect on average recruitment in a positive and a negative phase. So essentially, the coefficient, it's an exponential coefficient, but it transforms to the fraction of recruitment, the fraction of R0 that differs in a positive versus a negative phase. I have wanted to investigate other potential covariates beyond the PDO, and also whether or not we could do better with perhaps a moving average or annual values of the PDO versus just regimes. There's a number of things that could be explored there that I've not had time to address. It, it's, it's a challenge because it's unlikely to have a huge effect on the assessment. It doesn't, because we have such great age composition data, it's unlikely to affect the historical time series very much. But it does translate well. Right. And in fact, we only make it is. And we only make 3-year projections with the express purpose of not including recruitments that are uninformed by data in the spawning biomass projection. But that said, our understanding of the environmental relationships to halibut recruitment is something that does feed into the MSE. And so progress that we make there can potentially inform other hypotheses that we might want to explore in the MSE. So it's a useful endeavor, but it's not, I can't justify it as a high priority in a tactical sense purely from the perspective of the stock assessment.
Hmm. That's great. That's a really good explanation, and I think maybe that kind of puts the onus on us to help you justify it, especially as the MSE gets more and more use in decision making, right? So I think that's something that the SRB can discuss later.
Thanks. The other two components that I highlighted here are investigating the annual variability in the sex ratios in the commercial data via a bootstrap or some approach so that we can better inform future sampling, and also the treatment of whale depredation mortality and trying to find a way to better incorporate that in the assessment. Those are all things that honestly I can work on those whether or not I do a full assessment next year. But if I do a full assessment, then I have more latitude to incorporate them into models to show you in June, and then we can decide whether they should go into the tactical models in next September.
Great, thanks. That's helpful.
And sorry, one last interjection for Sean. One thing that I didn't, maybe I didn't highlight well, is that when I provide you guys with a full assessment in June, we'll have the ability to look at in detail at all of the diagnostics and residuals and fits to data. And we still have that period from June to September to address things like particular places where the models have lack of fit or other issues. So that's actually accommodated in the process for delivering the next full assessment, is that we would have a full iteration. And the nice thing is we'd be able to do that with the 2021 data. So we just don't necessarily get it in time for requests leading into the June meeting, but it is part of our process.
Yeah, good point. So we're not in a rush. I'm thinking back to our discussion about MSE versus the assessment earlier, and you mentioned there was some apparent deviation between the operating model and the assessment model, and so that's probably that's possibly one of those things where, you know, you have to be careful what the MSE is telling you if the operating models are nothing like or substantially divergent and more optimistic than your stock assessment. So I don't know if you guys want to comment on that tomorrow at the start of the MSE section, or ideally it might be something we would request for June, might be something that is a more direct comparison of the current assessment versus the operating models, and just to see, you know, how they compare.
Perhaps just to clarify, by divergent, I was more referring to the fact that the operating model is spatially explicit, and so the way in which the population functions in the operating model is quite different than the assessment, which is still coast-wide.
Sure.
But actually, as you recall from some of Alan's previous
yeah, so
the results are still very consistent.
okay, yeah, but it still would be useful to see, you know, them kind of overlaid on each other, see how similar they are. That would be interesting to look at, and it might give, you know, certainly would affect my confidence in what the, you know, MP statistics and stuff are saying. All right, 10 after 4. We were scheduled to finish, I believe, at 4:30, and have an SRB drafting session. Looks like we're good to go with that now, unless there are any issues. Is there anything we need to know about tomorrow? Maybe while we're here, we can. I think our normal approach is to take that first hour, the 9 to 10 a.m. hour, and try to squeeze in an SRB drafting session because of all the time differences we have. I mean, I know it's late for Sven, so it's usually up to him if he wants to defer to the morning or do something now. Sven, do you have an opinion on that?
I'm quite used to it by now. The CIE didn't stop till 3 o'clock in the morning, and that was for 5 days. So I can manage till 1, which is another 50 minutes or so.
Okay, well then let's do our drafting session now, and then we'll just stick to the schedule for tomorrow. Stick to the 9 a.m. start, as planned under the agenda.
Do you have the draft report, Sean?
Okay, so no,
I saw it in the
you emailed it to
emails,
me or
I
something,
think.
right?
All right, just
There it is.
confirm
Yeah.
you have it, Sean, as well. And if you do, then we can leave you all be.
Just waiting for it to open. Okay, I have it.
All right, we'll see you in the morning.
Are you able to project it?
Okay.
Yeah, they'll make you a
That's going to be
presenter
the trick. We're going to find out.
They'll make you a presenter in the side room, and then you can just present directly from your screen, share your screen. So the secretary will be around for a little while to give you a hand if there's any problems. All right.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
Right.
Good night, everyone.